I'm feeling really anxious because it really is just a lot of math.
That's what the people signed up for.
It's what the people signed up.
They weren't like, read this thrilling adventure story about gunfights. They were like, we're interested specifically in this story where a guy gives mathematical lectures.
Yeah.
Hello, and welcome to Woman with Bunny Ears, Season 3, Episode 6, a Twin Peaks podcast, also known as We Want Headbands, a one-character and four-syllable podcast in baseline. And today we will be discussing Planecrash, aka Project Lawful, Book 10 of the Keiko ordering. Is that correct, Keiko?
Yes. This
All
is
right.
Book 10.
And I am your host, the actual authorized negotiator, Flashy Man.
And I, of course, am your co-host, and sleeping with me will not improve your grades. Cakoluchiam.
That's very funny.
Yes.
All
That
right.
one. I think I did I use that before? No,
I don't think so.
I didn't. Okay.
No. All right.
But yeah,
well,
so
we have an action-packed episode today.
indeed. And I think we're going to leave listener feedback for next week.
Right.
Is that correct? So
Yeah.
Does that mean we should just jump in?
Yeah. We should
All right.
jump right in.
Cool. So I didn't on the webpage actually put the title on the reading section at least, but I think a fair title for this book, no pun intended, is Trade, because I think a lot of this that we are going to encounter is about trading.
Yep. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, which, of course, the reasonable place to start is romance novels, all about trade. Trade paperbacks, you might say.
Nice.
So, Interlude 9, Backstory. This is basically just the Haremites kind of trying to get a consistent story, and we're just sort of wrapping up their plan from earlier, and it kind of goes somewhere, but it doesn't really get very deep into things, right?
Yeah, it's just kind of some, I don't know, nice character writing, amusing reflections about romance novels and their tropes in real life, I guess.
There's an interesting interaction between Paxty and Ione, who I believe we have already established are huge nerds, arguing about how the plots of certain romance novels apply to what they want to do.
It's the plotline of any young adult novel with a female protagonist who will, at some point, have to learn the darkness of her own desires, Ione snaps at Paxty, as you'd know if you read more than one book a year.
We can work with this, though, Paxty says. Give me and Ione 20 minutes, and we'll come up with new plots for everyone's favorite romance books, with storylines that fit the new Cheliacs.
I'll slit her throat before we get 2 minutes in, says Ione. Ione also sees a much bigger problem with that idea, but she's curious whether Savar will spot it on her own.
Carissa is thinking that possibly she should ever have read a romance novel. Sounds like keeping track of a lot of lies. I'd rather have 1 or 2 good ones that are very appropriate for what we're trying to accomplish.
Ione nods. It's going to be interesting to see whether, or rather, how fast, Savar gets executed for heresy once she gets into the habit of noticing all the constant lies.
And so I pulled this out because Ione is here thinking that it is that this has to do with Carissa noticing the lies, and that's going to be heretical, is her noticing the lies. But I feel like this sort of gives evidence that that's not a thing that she thinks she needs to worry about, like that she already knows there are constant lies, right? I don't see why Ione thinks that would be a new thing. Because the whole coming up with
Mm.
lies kind of indicates that lies are the correct thing to do.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
kind of a weird line because I mean, my impression even was that the government of Cheliax is just like, yeah, we're evil, so they don't even have to lie about it. I suppose they do extra lies for fun on the side.
I mean, we've seen that they do at least enough lies to get Carissa to believe that making people better is the whole point of hell, which,
Oh, that is true. I wasn't sure
it's
whether
not.
that's. I guess that
It,
might be something they tell everyone. I kind of just thought Carissa was weird.
yeah. But I mean, they need to lie enough so that people who haven't sold their souls don't just, up and leave, because
Yeah.
if they did know that there is pointless eternal suffering,
Hmm.
then even in the face of all their mobility problems, the cost benefit analysis would, I'd say, definitely come down on the side of get the hell out.
True.
And
True.
in a
Literally.
lawful country, you'd hope that people would make those cost benefit analyses.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, and then Ione hops in and asks,
Actually, if I can get an authorized lie on this, none of us much like reading fiction at all. Cheliax has been devoting too many resources to the world wound, and the books written before Hell took over are trash.
so that's an interesting lie for a library mage to come up with, basically. Yeah, actually, we don't like reading, despite the
Mm.
fact that we were all hanging out in a library when you met us. And I happen to have magical powers that explicitly deal with library books. Uh,
Well,
but
that's a research
fiction, we
library.
draw the line at fiction. You
Yeah.
know?
We're no debutantes reading a story about some guy who doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
It is funny though.
but yeah, that said, she says, the books written before Hell took over are trash, uh, because Cheliax has been devoting resources to the world wound. Well, the reason that matters is because apparently in Cheliax, romance novels are commissioned by the Imperial Office? Question mark?
Yeah, like as a propaganda thing.
Yeah, but they seem to
Yeah.
think that is a good thing.
For the
Um,
moral instruction of their citizens.
Indeed, and that
Negative
it's
in parentheses.
right, and then it's very strange that Taldor doesn't have the same thing going
Mm,
on.
right.
But yeah. So yeah, that is our brief look at behind the scenes with the Haremites, and then we move on to Keltham wrapping up what he was doing before, which is asking to speak with the manager,
Right.
because he's a Karen.
Mhm.
And I'm curious about this because what Keltham being a Karen sort of indicates is that he expects from his Dathalon upbringing that it just makes sense for anybody who wants to negotiate anything to talk to the person at the top of the chain of responsibility, not necessarily command, because they don't have that same structure in Dathalon. But I just wonder, do their decision makers just have infinite time or something?
Nice.
There's a reason we delegate things. Uh, if
Well,
every Karen got to talk to the CEO, profits would tank, right? And Dathalon would hate that.
well, first of all, Keltham is like the most valuable man they've ever met, and he's factoring that into his considerations. And second of all, he doesn't need to talk to the CEO. He just needs to talk to somebody who's authorized to make a decision.
That's okay. That's kind of fair, but he's very bitter about having to talk to somebody else in between him and that
Hmm.
decision maker. Which I think he should not be as bitter about them having a system like that, even if he does think he should be an exception. Like the rate at which systems can adapt to new situations, like there being a very important alien who everybody would want to talk to, there's just a lot of institutional inertia behind the system they have where he has to go through middle management,
Right. He didn't strike me as particularly bitter, at least in this excerpt. More like, well, I'll go with you and help you as much as I can, but I need to actually make a deal with the guy who can make deals.
Yeah. It's like it does call out explicitly that
But Dathilan does have the concept of hiding an unusually high willingness to pay so that sellers can't price discriminate against you, and sending in a negotiator who doesn't actually have the power to make commitments is a standard known failure mode to avoid.
That's the Karen thing, and
Keltham will of course say all this to Marta directly. None of that meta information has any obvious rationale for keeping it secret.
Like, okay, maybe he understands that, but he's sort of, he's saying, yeah, well, this situation is stupid. Basically, this is a known failure mode to avoid, which is like, come on, you don't have to be that rude.
On Dathilani, it's basic politeness to avoid common failure modes with your interlocutors.
Yeah, but like he could give it like 5 minutes or whatever. Just
well,
you don't need to go up front with that.
However he actually said that isn't recorded, so I assume he's just very casually saying like, well, of course I would need to make the deal with the actual deal person so that you guys don't try the old rope-a-dope on me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's see.
This same post reminds me of a very common grammatical thing that happens in at least this glowfic, which I can elaborate on, or we can just save it for later because it doesn't stop happening.
Go ahead.
All right. Well,
I love grammar. We've established.
True. And this is one of the most famous parts of English grammar, the tense. And
Ooh.
There's an interesting thing that happens in glowfic, presumably because of the communal nature of it, where it just shifts to the future tense. Like, it describes some stuff, and then it shifts to the future tense. Like in this post, Keltham will, of course, say all this to Marta directly. None of the meta information has any obvious rationale for keeping it secret. So,
right.
Usually the posts are like Keltham says, but in this one it's Keltham will say. Presumably because that could be interrupted or preempted by something.
Yeah,
although
I've kind of noticed that too, where like Yarwain will be asked what he's going to do, and he'll give his intentions for like, this is what the character wants to do. I don't think that we need to go through a big conversation in order to hash out the details of how that happens. Is that okay with you? Is basically what he's saying. And then like from that question, if Lintemond replies with something else that suggests it's okay, then that's just sort of assumed as part of the continuity, right?
Right.
But yeah, that's a good catch. I like that.
Yeah. I just thought that was neat. I don't know if we've seen any instances where he says like, Keltham will do X, and then Lintemond comes back with, Keltham can't do X, actually. I think so far it's always worked. Could just be forgetting it, though.
I look forward to seeing where they do have arguments. Although maybe that's just what happened. Like there's a lot of these posts, like this one even says updated January 9th. So, like, maybe there are situations where he asks and then gets rebuked and then just goes back and edits the thing appropriately.
Could be. Could be.
Could be.
Yeah. All right. What's next?
So Keltham considers that it's time to start fairly dividing gains from trade.
Mhm.
And he also notes here that maybe it's going to be possible because there's this weird distrust system in Cheliax that in order to, bypass some of this bureaucracy, he can maybe just tap himself with fairness. The spell they've established is all about, you have to make fair trades, and that people seeing him with that symbol on his forehead will know that they can't cheat him, basically.
Mm.
And so he's wondering if that'll work. But I guess we'll have to see. That certainly doesn't seem polite, I think, at first blush. But it's an interesting thing when it comes to big contract negotiations. So
Mhm.
then, after Keltham considers that, we move into chapter 81, which I think is correctly titled here, Contact with the Enemy.
Nice.
Yeah. And that's a callback to previous in the previous book when Carissa was trying to work out the backstory with the Haremites. She said, "No plan survives contact with the enemy."
And here we are,
And here we are.
contacting the enemy.
Here's the contact. And I think like it basically doesn't come up. Am I wrong? I think
No,
this just doesn't come up throughout this lecture. The romance novel and all that backstory, that careful backstory they've been working on.
no, I don't think it does.
So, no plan survives, as it were. Just because it's not even implemented.
Yeah.
Future, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing we get with Broom, which I'm very happy about, is that even though he's still deferring to the wizards, they at least remembered that invisibility serves a purpose. And they've authorized him to use his invisibility if he needs to. So, like, all my objections, they resolved that problem. They learned.
Nice.
And yeah. I mean, I still think it would be best if he were always invisible. But, because Keltham's uncomfortable and keeping him comfortable is very important, I think, to everybody. Let's give him a little concession here. But yeah, with Broom following him in, that's really weird to him to have sort of an auditor in his class. And he just sort of assumes everybody else thinks it's just as weird. But like Broom is a slave. Slaves, are in the background basically, such that people barely even notice their existence, I'm sure. And it's probably assumed that, if a slave is following somebody, then it's like that's their house elf, more or less. So like I don't think anybody would have thought anything about it except that Keltham brought it up and
Right.
acted like this is a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Well, as they bring up shortly into this interaction, they they think probably, or they think it's possible he's learned about slavery and now he's upset. So I think maybe they would have put two and two together and gone, wait a minute, there's a slave like waiting on Keltham. Wait, hold on, he's not gonna like that one.
So maybe this is like they're seeing this as sort of a test, or he's seeing it maybe as a test, or they're seeing that they think that he's seeing it as a test that, okay, he's got a slave now. Is everybody he's looking at okay with slavery? He's wondering if this is weird to them.
No, I think they just thought he was about to launch into an explanation of why slavery is wrong, but he didn't, so he clearly doesn't know what's going on. But it would have been weird for him to have a slave following him around anyway.
Keltham is probably the kind of person who would not give Dobby a sock.
Really?
Because the house elves love serving people. It's, if that's what they want to do, let people do what they want to do. And
he hasn't integrated that part of his psyche yet. He still thinks that you should give house elves money for their services, just at a 20% discount, because that's what they want to do.
Oh yeah, that's right. He did in their games, which I don't know if this is before where we are or after, but I think it's after. In his games, somebody was doing the very altruistic thing and not taking all the gains from trade that they could, and Keltham just bitterly set the profits he got from those transactions aside and returned them at the end of the lesson.
Yeah.
But yeah,
right.
We'll get to that later. I think.
I think it would be kind of funny if they did explain slavery to Keltham in a way that makes him think it might be okay. I just think that would be a funny feat for them to pull.
Yeah.
It'd be a tough nut to crack.
It's interesting that I mentioned the house elves because they are basically two wizards and humans, aliens more or less. They have completely different values from humanity, and their decision to trade in a way that they act as slaves is one of those things where you kind of have to interact on as you would with an alien. Again, I might be jumping ahead, but do we discuss interacting or trading with aliens? Is that ahead or behind us?
I mean, I think it's actually both. I think he just keeps thinking about it from time to time.
He just keeps thinking. Yeah, because I think one of the things he says about trading with aliens is that even if their utility functions would accept a lower payment, if you want something from them or if you need something from them, you should never give them just what they asked for. You should give them something that is more valuable to you in addition, right? There was and or will be an example of sort of the situation in I forget what movie it is where the aliens come to Earth and they just need to take all of our water, and
wow.
We kind of need that water to survive, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Keltham's got a solution to that, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think that is later, but yes.
That
anyhow,
is later. Okay, cool. So Keltham is at this point now still thinking about okay, am I in a romance LARP or an arrow LARP, I think. And so he does sort of a straw poll of who here has weird away from median backstories. And there's of course the immediate question of well, compared to what? I think it's Carissa asks whether it's compared to the average Chilaxian or compared to, in Carissa's case, a wizard who works at the World Wound,
right?
Or in the Heremite's case, third-year students at Wizarding College. And this is something that I slap my forehead at this because Keltham introduces this as quote unquote unanchored scales. And then upon receiving this question, he immediately gives them anchors for this scale. Right. And so the anchor he gives them is for him as a Dathilani, how weird would this be? And here I have a quote as well.
I think what we're looking for is the expected degree to which I, a Dath Ilani, would say something like, "Wait, what?" after I found out. So the fact that you spent years at the World Wound would be like a third of the way across, because it's surprising to me and matters to me. While you being secretly a dragon shape-changed into a human, if you knew I'd find that out later in the relationship, would be more like 2/3 across. Maybe let's say it's only past the halfway point. If you'd expect other people here to be surprised.
And so he gives that anchor for the scales, but honestly, I feel like those need to be separate scales, whether it's weird to him and whether it's weird to a Galarianite. I think that partly because he shouldn't give them a scale, but also because this question now that he's asking, like, how weird is it compared to me, is going to get an answer which is confounded by how much that particular person thinks they know about him.
Right. Yeah.
And the answer, frankly, is close to no, close to none, right? And so it's just going to be their assumptions based on what they think an alien values. So where on that scale, he's just going to get wild answers, which of course he does because they answer motivatedly.
During this section, it kind of like detailed everyone's answers, or perhaps not everyone, but a good portion of the people. And then Keltham says, "Wow, what an interesting pattern of answers." And I was thinking, like, oh, I don't actually know what the pattern is.
Yeah.
Do you know?
So he says
it doesn't quite fit. The LARP begins with 5 primary love interests, some of whom start out knowing about some of the others, plus a bunch of relatively normal girls who think everyone else there is also normal. Half the respondents thought everyone had backgrounds, almost totally uninteresting to a Dath Ilani, which may indicate a failure of perspective taking, or a failure to process the instructions somehow.
So he kind of notices the problem that I saw too. But yeah, I think the pattern is how many of them voted above average. So I didn't have the exact values, but I do have a handful here. Carissa marks the lower half because if he learned that she were upper quartile, the jig would be up anyway. So, like, let's play it safe here. Tanaya.
But if she had said she was even more interesting, then she could throw even more convoluted lies at him later, and he wouldn't get suspicious.
But we have established that she doesn't want to lie. And
she needs that variance for later.
Yeah. So yeah, Carissa marks the lower half. Tanya or Tanaya, I say is humble. So I think she's also lower half. Marichelle wishes she were more interesting, so I think she's lower half too. Ione is unfortunately interesting, and she's smart enough to know that 50% should be average Galarian. So I think Ione is above average. Paxti is probably not above average, but she has a growth mindset, and so she marks above average anyway. Asmodia is a nihilist, of course. She puts down 0 and nearly 0 because she doesn't want to participate in this. We explicitly do not get Pilar's answer. And Gregoria, I think we might have seen her story before? No. Here we learn she is. I wrote down basically a descendant of Genghis Khan. She's the heir
Oh,
to
so
the barony
unique.
Blaines. Yeah, but so is everybody else. But then
Mhm,
I
mhm.
looked back on this and she said her father is the heir to the barony. He's not just one of the descendants of the Baron of Blaines or whatever. Um, so, but it's kind of just that there's a lot more barons than there are dukes, which are the next level up.
Mm.
So she's got some, pseudo royal lineage or noble lineage, but it doesn't really mean anything. So I think she marks lower half too. But yeah, so above average, we do get, I think what Keltham said is 3 to 5. Above average, which I think he's looking for above average as the quote unquote primary love interests, those that stand out among the crowd. But like, I think Asmodia, just by thinking that she is completely uninteresting, makes herself interesting.
What is that? Some kind of paradox?
Yeah, it's kind of paradoxical, which I think goes back to Ione, who remembers that 50% should probably be average for them at least, uh, which is more than not surprising to Keltham because average Galarian is going to be surprising, right?
Mm. Yeah.
Whereas
And
Asmodia thinks that putting down 0 means she's totally uninteresting. But basically, by doing that, she's saying that she's closer to Keltham, I think.
mm.
Which,
Mm.
right? He says the expected degree to which I, a Dathalani, would say something like, wait, what? Uh,
Which he's
after
already
I
done
found out
multiple
your backstory.
times, if you want to take him literally.
That's true. He does that for everything.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I think Asmodia would not trigger the wait what in terms of her having foreign values or foreign thought patterns, but would trigger the wait what in terms of not triggering the wait what when everybody else does.
Mm.
Um, and as it turns out, later we will see more of Asmodia. So she, I think, definitely is a character who may be one of the 3 to 5 primary love interests if we ever get to romance beyond Carissa.
Right. And I mean, the whole point of this is just like, am I in a visual novel? Are some of you like very clearly interesting because you're the protagonists?
Yeah, like who's playing this game? Uh,
Uh,
so then they did this vote by handing him pieces of paper, and the god of or the representative of the god of making sure of cleaning up messes, making sure things don't go awry, asks for the papers, and he says no, and basically
mm,
treats Broom like a child. And I feel like that's disrespectful in a way that one would disrespect a slave, you might say,
oh,
or a house elf. So he's kind of
tempted to the
getting
dark
into,
side.
yeah, he's kind of getting into this, I think. Uh,
Mm,
but yeah, basically there's an argument between Keltham and Broom where I thought that argument should have been resolved. That what Broom says needs to be verified.
mm. Well, my understanding is like Keltham doesn't want to show him because he didn't ask for permission for these answers to be public yet anonymized, and I figure Dathalani has pretty strong norms about that kind of thing.
Yeah, the privacy norm. But yeah, Carissa at least gets it. She's like, yeah, he should see that, but we can't tell Keltham about it. Tolman's.
Uh-huh.
she explicitly says, this is why you have to tell Keltham about Atollmans, because otherwise he will not treat Broom like an institution you shut up and cooperate with. So yeah, he definitely is a don't question him. He's gonna ask for weird things. He's got his reasons, which behind the scenes we know he doesn't. He's just sort of winging it a little bit here. But you should treat him like he's not winging it.
Well, as Broom surmises, it does not look like a situation that is not heading into an enormous mess.
that is true. But yeah, and then they get set on fire. The answers, that is.
Phew. You have to specify in this story.
Yeah. So that closes out what I call the chapter, and we move into the lesson.
Oh wait, I forgot. They take
ahead.
a poll whether they should let him see them or not.
Oh, right. Yeah. Keltham leaves it up to them. And sorry to drag us back with that, but there's that gives them an opportunity to show Keltham that they should treat Broom like the representative of the Atollmans that he is. But I don't know if they actually know that about Broom yet.
Mm.
And I think they definitely don't know that Keltham knows that about Broom, because they've just been over here talking about romance novels while Keltham was out there casting See Invisibility or whatever.
I think whoever's giving them orders, if someone is giving them orders, probably knows, or maybe that's just maybe they're constantly asking you for your permission to do things, and then if you don't give them permission, they're like, joke's on you, we're evil here.
Yeah. Keltham's got an interesting voting system where you write a V or an X or a V made out of, or it's a disconnected V, two strokes that don't touch. So it looks like you're all making the same mark, which is a useful, I think, and a good idea for taking polls, because I've definitely run into the problem of people cheating off each other in straw polls, where it's like, why would you cheat? But still, the peer pressure hits them. So this is a good way of dealing with that.
Right.
So shall we move on to fairness?
Let's.
So this is basically just the introduction to our lecture, which is like, all right, some people value something a lot, and some people value something a little, or they value something else a lot. How do you meet in the middle? And how do you determine that? Especially, I think he says, does he not mention money? I think that's part of the gimmick here, is that they're not talking about money for most of this lesson. So it's even harder to meet in the middle, because you can't like numerically work stuff out.
Right.
Yeah.
This book is kind of just stage setting and sort of introduces, I don't know, what I kind of think is normal human negotiation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where you just, which has always confused me. So I'm glad we're getting this lecture about it, frankly.
Yeah. And it's also confusing in like the Pathfinder system. So I'm gonna have a little aside here that Carissa notes that you're allowed to bluff in negotiations. So like how competent you are at bartering is going to affect the price. And in the Pathfinder system, there is no haggle skill. There's haggle in some systems, but I think mostly to keep people from like retiring and setting up a goat farm and having that be their role-playing adventure. They have fixed prices in in Pathfinder.
Mm.
But people still like to haggle. And so a lot of people think about what skills you should use for this. And there are skills like appraise is a skill, which I think is a weird one to have instead of haggle, but it's there. Bluff, of course. Diplomacy is also one for negotiations, which can be applied to haggling. And sense motive, which is this person trying to cheat me? And so, like, if you really want to emulate haggling, you do some combination of these, and there are some really interesting like sequences of skill checks that people have come up with for this. Anyhow, I will not go into that.
Sure. Yeah.
So Keltham's fascinated by the idea that everybody here thinks haggling is the way to figure out the ideal price. And so he jumps into or rather, we the readers get some background on the Dathilani lesson for financial literacy layer 2, which frankly is the bulk of this chapter, the bulk of this book. Let's say it's not the bulk by length, but it is a summary of the much longer part of the book where Keltham actually gives this lecture that comes after.
Yeah.
So the
Which
interlude,
was weird.
Dathilon gives us like how the lessons are supposed to run, and then we can contrast that Dathilani perspective with how we see the lessons actually run against Galarian, because of course no plan survives contact with the enemy, here being the Heremites. So we are swiftly introduced to some comments by Eliezer, actually. Yeah, this is a few tags down. There's a link to a less wrong post by Eliezer titled "The Point of Trade," which I think he intends us to read because we need the background that Keltham and Dathilon think almost on a fundamental level that having commerce and trade is better fundamentally than not, even if like it's not obvious how it makes things better. There are at least some good side effects.
You know, you do remind me that way back at the beginning of this book, Keltham references price discrimination, which is a concept I didn't know about until I took an econ class in college. So everybody pause the podcast and go take a college level econ class and then come back. You don't have to do that, but it would help.
So welcome back, everybody.
Yeah.
I hope that has made some things more clear for you. So anyhow, that's all not this, but it was called out by Eliezer in a link in our scenario of kids trading with each other for different flavored jelly chips, which is fun, I guess. I like blue jelly chips. And yeah, I'm kind of curious how that relates to the post that Eliezer called out for us, because the reason specialization works is because you can make more things. But trading jelly chips, you can't make more things by getting people more concentrated jelly chipness. So this sort of covers the first scenario. I think is just that different people value things differently.
And so that pathway of learning continues. I did notice right before that, it says, after presenting the false principle that it's only from differences of preferences that trades happen.
Most kids will give the brief baseline comeback that colloquially translates to, "I probably would have believed it if I wasn't pretty sure you were trolling me, though I haven't seen anything that I suspect is the real argument against it."
Which is, that's many an answer I would give would just be that.
Yeah.
Just be like, well, why don't you just tell me the next thing you want to tell me? That's a different answer. But, I don't have oopsie doopsie or whatever the baseline term is for, well, the point is that you've told me a false thing that kind of sounds true.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that those scenarios exist, though, because Keltham right now is doing a very Earth style lesson. He's standing up there at his, erasable marker wall, and that all the Heramites are taking notes. But in these lessons, ostensibly, it's the big kids who are teaching the small kids, right? It does say that sometimes a watcher will come by and say something or another. But most of the lessons, supposedly in Dathalon, I think, are children to children. So gotchas should not be as common.
Yeah, I don't know.
Right.
I seem to remember that there's a mix of certain types of instruction, and some instruction is given by specifically people who can retain wonder at things that would seem trivial to an educated person most of the time. But yeah, most of the time, I think older children are instructing younger children.
So anyhow, they move on to the ultimatum game, which this is where Keltham feels like he gets unfair profits in some of his trades, and he sets aside all his unearned chips to redistribute after the lesson ends, which is silly.
What an honorable guy.
Yeah, it's particularly silly for him, but I think at that point it's an honor thing, and he does care about honor to some extent. But if he had the opportunity to do this with adults, I don't think he would do the honorable thing, because I think he assumes that adults are they've had their chance to do or to be better, right? They're not still learning. So if he gets profits, he's not going to redistribute them voluntarily.
Maybe. Although on Galarian, maybe he won't think they have had a chance to be better because they didn't go to Dathalani school. So
yeah. And I think at this point with the ultimatum game that they've moved on to, I think this is where we first get rid of the blue and red jelly chips thing, where suddenly everybody's preferences become aligned. And then the next game is where we get each of the students has tokens that determine how much jelly chips they can produce, or they can produce ovens with their oven factories, or they can, at a meta level, produce things that produce things. And so they need to figure out how that works. Oh, this is the point where if you win the game that they're playing, this is where you as a student get your first investment account, which is cool that they get investment accounts as rewards in school. But in this game, sometimes somebody is given a dishonesty card, which means they're supposed to try to take unfairly from other people, which I relate to Cheliax here. I think Cheliax from Asmodeus has gotten the dishonesty card. And here's our alien analogy, right? So you shouldn't offer less than something is worth to you in a barter situation because it's foolish to lose out on something when you could be gaining. And the analogy here says, would civilization offer less than 1 billion labor hours to an alien bearing knowledge of how to eliminate whole swaths of diseases hitting large sections of the population? Parentheses, no. So yeah, that's like, if you really have a problem with these diseases and the aliens can eliminate them and it is within your ability to pay, then you should. And even if like you don't know what the aliens value, you should try to give them something that you think is valuable at least. Pay in your own currency, which here is labor hours.
I see what you mean.
So I think we've gotten to what I made marked as the end, roughly. So Eliezer has another meta comment here, which I will quote to you.
Of course, in a normal Dath Ilani economic fiction isekai story, the entire world you end up in is not insane in every part. There may be one insane point of departure with some insane consequences lawfully extrapolated. But the author is not going to throw an entire insane world at you. It wouldn't be credible. A normal Dath Ilani thrown into another world does not come in expecting to need enough money to make lots and lots of important investments that the natives haven't made because the natives are insane. They're expecting to find an alien efficiency of no simple ways to make everyone collectively much wealthier, not the howling absence of that efficiency. Keltham wasn't expecting Golarion either. He did, however, catch on in short order to what he currently thinks is the magnitude of the problem. It is possible he will need a lot of money to solve it.
So yes, I think that is a correct assessment of the situation. This is a great story for us, rationalists on Earth. It would not be accepted in Dathalon.
It's
or
a
maybe
very
people just
amusing
wouldn't think to write it.
statement of the situation we find ourselves in here.
So here I think we then get the solution to the problem, which we're going to get to later in the lesson, which has to do with permutations, which is fun. And then we get an idea of what Keltham supposedly thinks that Cheliax will think about what his added value to the economy or the value of Cheliax will be. And I'm not quite sure what he thinks will be the difference between what he believes his contribution is and what they believe his contribution is. Do you have any idea? Like,
Well, I don't think they're going to use the Shapley value, which is the method invented by Lloyd Shapley, the economist. This was very, very nice. So I don't get many of these anymore, but sometimes I'm thinking about a problem and I'm like, And then it turns out some like really smart guy actually solved the problem. He figured it out. It's just done. It's this permutation method. Yay. So I think that Cheliax is going to underestimate his value and possibly maliciously, or possibly just because why not?
Yeah, I think also from Keltham's perspective, we also have this note that
Cheliax mentioned difficulties in accurately measuring the gains to the country, and may intend to offer a measuring methodology expected to be an underestimate of the real value. Or it could be that Cheliax is thinking the split is about direct profits from project sales, where Chelish consumers are capturing much more value than the sale price of the products, the consumer surplus.
Is he thinking that Cheliax is going to measure GDP and he would prefer they measure something else?
I think in that specific instance, it's more like the government of Cheliax is thinking like, boy, this Keltham guy can make steel, and then we can sell that steel to our citizens, and then
Mhm.
whatever profits will just split between Keltham and us, the government. But Keltham is assuming they're like a good government that cares about their citizens. And so when the citizens use the good steel, and then they can make trains and their lives are improved incredibly,
And
even
the
though that
government
wasn't really
expects more tax money from that. So what they exactly sell the stuff for is not the full price,
um
basically.
well, in my example I was trying to draw out, like, the even if the price point of the steel didn't capture all of the amazing benefits to the citizens' lives, the government should still be trying to offer Keltham some portion of that uncaptured value because it benefits their citizens.
So hypothetically, if Keltham's value is a lot, such that it's maybe even comparable to what they can sell his, method for creating steel at,
Mhm.
what how could they afford to pay him more than 99% of that?
Mhm.
you know
Uh,
it Even though like they expect maybe to get more tax revenue in the future, they don't know that. So
right.
they should, I would think, be giving him be giving him a discounted amount
Yeah.
because of the uncertainty that they don't know they're going to get returns.
Mm. Well, they could also pay him like conditionally as a proportion of something,
Oh, right. I forgot. Contracts can
various
be, you
things
know,
like that.
256 clauses long. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
So yeah, and now we get a little interlude from somewhere in a place that is not this place, and it's
Oh yeah.
from Thelem, who Keltham sat next to on the plane, which was a nice callback.
He boards the aircraft, strolls a third of the way down the aisle with his eyes assessing all he passes, and then sits next to the first person who looks like a more promising seat partner than all of the previous people he passed. This is a woman reading Alt 9, Book 3 of Reckless Investor Meowsfor, a book series not entirely ungermane to his own life interests. Keltham takes out his own copy of 3 to Infinity by Petherial, reading it long enough for it to be a costly signal that he actually cares about the book's content. Maybe a conversation will start, maybe it won't. The woman's name is Thelem. She is actually a fiction matchmaker, whose interest in reckless investing is purely as fiction. She does not aspire at all to the impossible, and even self-contradictory, art of investing in ways contrary to other investors' wisdom, even as all other investors try to do the same.
That's an interesting callback, but also it's a call out because so she's an alt from a different story, which is also by Eliezer and a Glowfic collaboration with Alicorn. I don't know if there are more authors. I just flipped through a bit of it. Sorry if I missed any credits. But these two posts by Thelem are basically Eliezer complaining that nobody takes him seriously because he doesn't have a PhD.
And you know what? He's right.
He's right. He's right. Yeah. But it is interesting. I think this note is worth calling out that um, one of his complaints is that he can't even get published for free by signing away his rights to the status of having come up with this idea, because anybody else who publishes his works would be shamed for stealing, basically, for taking credit for someone else, even if he
Hmm.
sold that credit, you know,
Hmm.
which is a
Right.
true thing about the real world. And it's a weird thing if you think about it from both directions. Uh, but it's the sort of thing that one thinking in Homo economicus sense would find to mitigate the credentialing problem, which unfortunately the people who gatekeep by credentials are not going to accept that. They are not Homo economicus.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this is Eliezer not quite winking at the reader, but it's kind of him, I think, trying to excuse himself for writing fan fiction instead of doing actual work, which I don't mean that derisively. Eliezer, please thank you for all you do. But yeah, he's calling out himself a little bit, I think.
Well, he has written less wrong posts about how the concept of economic or decision theory rationality that economists seem to operate under. And I'm no economist. Maybe some other economist has already written a paper about why the ultimatum game shows that actually we weren't being irrational the whole time. Stop using that word. Anyway, but various economists will tell you that it's economically irrational to refuse the money in the ultimatum game at any point. And Eliezer has written real blog posts. In fact, even in a book, technically, about how that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So he gave it his shot.
He gave it what he could.
I don't think I've ever encountered this probabilistic refusal of unfair situations, trades, ultimatums, what have you, beforehand.
I think that's what Eliezer was trying to call out with the Thelum interruption there, was that the probabilistic thing, I think he believes, is a novel idea from him.
Well,
or at
if
least
it is,
he is promoting it more strongly than anybody else.
I could certainly see that as a perfectly legitimate. I'd read an econ paper and then I'd go, nice, that guy solved that problem. Very good. Put that in the Wikipedia.
Yeah, but unfortunately, it I think almost 100% depends on everybody using the same algorithm. And so if you don't have a PhD and get published and then get citations from dozens to hundreds of other economists, you and a handful of others are going to be the only ones using this probabilistic thing, which means people are not going to give you fair prices that factor in your probabilistic acceptance of the trade. And so you're just going to be disappointed all the time.
See, I thought the point of the algorithm was that I suppose it changes the case if you aren't allowed to communicate. But if you communicate that this is your algorithm, then it means that the best choice for your opponent to take is a fair trade.
Yeah, but that also depends on being able to haggle, which the system isn't set up for. The system that is the world isn't really set up in general to promote haggling, let's say.
I mean, people negotiate all the time.
They negotiate all the time, but on the scale of development in nations, when you think of haggling, you think of less developed nations, right?
Oh, yeah, this actually relates to a caveat that we didn't get into earlier, which is that they're explicitly, or at least when he was introducing the concept of how do you find out the fair price for something? I guess the market price is introduced, and then he says, okay, but what if there isn't a market price? What if I'm selling my shirt, which there's only one of,
right?
And it has, wildly different and complicated value for various people. What would the fair price be?
Yeah.
Well, going back to our place in the text, I thought this little cutaway to Thelum was very exciting. And first of all, it was extremely funny, like how Thelum swiftly infers that Earth's moon prevents its inhabitants from thinking clearly about negotiation.
Indeed.
And then also, yeah.
And then sometime later is going to conclude that it's not the moon.
No. Oh no.
Sometime later being exactly 2 lines of the story, or of
Mm-hmm.
the very next tag.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wait, does that mean Dathalon doesn't have a moon?
I don't actually know if Thelum is from Dathalon.
Well, she
The
was on
fic.
the plane in Dathalon.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Well, but she's also in Earth right now, so like she's probably a traveler.
Yeah, she got isekai'd to Earth, presumably, in the plane
Yeah.
crash. That's how all great Elfic
Oh.
travel happens.
Oh, maybe that is it. Yeah. I
Yeah.
don't know if I mentioned, but if anybody wants to look up the fic that Thelum is from, it's called "But Hurting People Is Wrong."
Yeah. Which, checking the, thing, it says Thelum in Eclipse. So, I guess that would be a spoiler for But Hurting People is Wrong if you didn't read, the tagline of it. But anyway, if it's in Eclipse, then maybe the moon is magical. I don't know much about the Eclipse universe, but I think they have werewolves. So
Ooh.
I guess maybe werewolves are magical and the moon is just regular. Anyhow,
All right.
I found this exciting because, whoa, a whole extra story for free that from this fake excerpt that we have sounds very funny and cool. Might have to go read that at some point.
Indeed. Yeah. Maybe that'll be next episode.
I don't think we should detour in the middle of it, but in the middle of what we're doing to read this story. But maybe we'll keep the listeners on their toes.
Indeed. All right. So I guess now we are moving on to chapter 80 something, which I have titled Triangle Trade.
Oh yeah,
And
chapter
yeah,
83.
yeah. So we've just finished. We've just finished learning all about Dathalon's introduction to fairly distributing gains from trade, and now it's time for Cheliax, or at least the harem of wizard students, to learn about fairly distributing gains from trade. And my first note here, which I took, I take notes in order that I read them, or in order, in reading order. And my first note is, okay, this is basically a summary of all the shit we've learned so far, which was very optimistic take. I figured the previous chapter was the long form, and now that we've gotten all that detail, we're just gonna see a summary in passing, like this is how well they did on this exercise, this is how well they did on this exercise, these are some plot points. But no, we go through the entire thing all over again.
Yeah. While the Dathalon was expositing, I thought, okay, so I guess Keltham is explaining this at the same time. Nope.
Nope. This is background for us. So yeah.
So you can fully appreciate the lesson that's about to come as the reader.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, so you can fully appreciate it. You would think that would mean you can fully appreciate the contrast between Dathalon and Cheliax, but I feel like there's not actually that much contrast. Like it kind of
Yeah.
went just about as well with the wizards in training as it did with Intelligence 18 children in Dathalon, right? There were a few quirks along the way, which we
Right.
can get into, but for the most part, they still all kind of came to the same conclusions and agreed with the quote unquote correct answers. So yeah, I was a little bit disappointed by that, but on the other hand, I do like seeing it in character more than I like seeing the summary in Dathalon version. And I have a note later, which maybe I should bring up here about the meta value of this. Where is
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. No, that's near the. I'm sure it's more appropriate where I put it, which is
Oh, okay.
back in all the way in chapter 86. So we'll get there eventually.
Wow.
But for now, we've got so one thing where it is slightly different. We only get a few lines of this, so again, it's like not much different. Is that Chilaxians don't really give a shit about fair gains from trade. They just trade. They try to get what they want, and immediately Marichel starts to invent currency, which
Mhm.
she does in an interesting way, which is negative wrist slaps, which that's sort of like a coupon for like I will do your chores for you type thing that you would get in a trade between Earth kids. But like it has no value right now. It just maybe in the future it'll be worth, oh god, no, please don't hit me. Here, have this piece of paper. Or, look at this number in this account.
Yeah, that is a funny way to put it, certainly.
Keltham does correctly point out that, that does give you an incentive to just not play the game at all, which, their answer is, I want the whole system to stay in place. And so, of course, I'm not going to quit the system. Like, their answer is basically, we're going to do this because we have to, because our teacher told us, and it's important for the lesson, regardless of whether it's painful, and it doesn't need to be painful, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then they have a digression about how on Dathalon, children like to go to school because schools are optimizing that for various reasons. God, imagine how horrifying it would be if children had to go to school.
Yeah.
And didn't like it. Ugh.
Yeah. They also, I just want to comment, we get a few language notes in this, in these coming chapters. One of them is Keltham is surprised that that the Taldane word for something is town guard, and that's interesting to him. And that's sort of like whoever it is that mediates the system. And I think what he's thinking there is, that's strange. Why would you need a person mediating trade to be the same sort of person who protects you from presumably physical attacks? Which is, it's a good point.
See, I just thought he thought it was a remarkably parochial sort of thing to do. You mean they don't have an agency that goes around and does this made out of specialists? It's just some guy who makes sure pigs don't run away?
Yeah. Yeah, the parochial nature of this whole system is also a surprising thing to Keltham all over the place. But yeah, so I have a quote here, and let me see if I can find it. But first you were mentioning that kids in Dathalon actually want to go to school, right?
Yes, and especially because if they really didn't want to be there, they would simply all coordinate to destroy the school.
Yeah.
Because they're Dathalani. They have incredible powers.
Which is weird, because, from what we've learned about Dathalon, like, you don't do things like coordinate to destroy things. You make people aware of incentive structures that, if they were to break down, would result in things that are similarly catastrophic to destroying things.
Right. But it's all a counterfactual.
Right. But but Keltham is stating it as if the act of destroying things is the counterfactual, as opposed to the act of the students not wanting to go to school, and so telling, basically not threatening, the Dathalon alternative to threatening, which is making people aware of the counterfactual disincentives, right?
Oh, so you think it's like a double counterfactual?
Yeah, I don't think that I don't think that if all the kids didn't like school, they would blow it up. I think if all the kids didn't like school, they would, quit and elect a new superintendent, or all go to their parents and say, "Hey, look, parents,
True.
I
Yeah.
would rather have a flaming pile of rubble than go to school today."
I imagine they could also just go to a different school. They probably have school choice over there on Dathalon.
Yeah.
So it is sort of an interesting example to jump to. But this is the evil place, so they immediately think of the worst possible school you could have, I guess.
Well, but that's Keltham thinking of the worst possible school, right?
Yeah, but they've introduced the idea of like, okay, we're gonna do wrist slaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's negative sum already.
Yeah. But interestingly, this is a part where Cheliax sort of gets one up on Dathalon with regard to sanity, because Marichal just says, Chelish kids do not coordinatedly try to destroy our schools. Even wizarding kids who are smart. It wouldn't even be hard with magic. You wouldn't need coordinated distractions, but no one would do it, even if you'd made a very bad mistake at school and were going to be disciplined. Right. Um, so yeah, like, even though she, as it mentions right away, is channeling Taldor there, it's still something that is believable enough for Cheliax, and they think is worth telling Keltham that it's kind of like not a we're better than you, but we are more sane than you situation.
Yeah, there's a bit of that. Or are they simply trapped in a bad equilibrium?
Yeah. Let's see. So I've then pulled out a quote here about disincentivizing wrist slaps by normalizing literally paying for the privilege to beat your child? Question mark. So I've got this quote.
Look, sufficiently young kids do get slaps on the wrist. Civilization doesn't like it. I don't like it. But even Dath-Ilan never figured out how to produce healthy adults, while never doing that at any point. But every time you set up a situation where a kid gets told that they need to do something, or else gets slapped on the wrist, you also add some value to an investment account. The kid gets access to when they're older, such that even if the kid was secretly an adult in a kid's body, they would still be calculating a net benefit on being present for the whole transaction. And having to pay that amount to set up a potential wrist slap situation reminds adults to check every time whether they really needed a wrist slap there.
And note here that it's not whether they would really need a wrist slap at this point. It's whether they really needed a wrist slap there. So there definitely is corporal punishment for kids here. They just put $1 in the beating jar every time they do smack their kid, right?
I imagine it's kind of a hot stove situation. Like, don't touch that hot stove. Slapping your hand, literally.
Yeah, I mean, mildness is an arguable situation, but like, it still seems like Dathalon hasn't completely banned hitting your kid. It's just made it economically disincentivized.
True.
Which is interesting
True.
because, I think that is a path that we are not headed toward, morally speaking. Go
It's
ahead.
also very galaxy-brained, like, we gotta align the incentives, even for this thing that, I suppose ideally, if you do have to slap your child's wrist and say, don't run into the street, then, they are benefiting from that. But now they also get $1 so that they're extra aligned.
Yeah. So they've then got some comments on what people think about kids, or the how raising kids to this way leads to the adults in the system that we want. And so we get a few opinions, like Gregoria says basically that, in her opinion, adults are basically children themselves, and so the ways we treat children should be the same. And let's see. Marichel is just thinking, like, you don't actually want adults who believe themselves entitled to blow up any system that isn't serving them. So, yeah, but like that's kind of what Cheliax has, not Dathalon, but I guess Keltham thinks that what Dathalon is doing is giving that that impression to the kids. And Tanya says the kids can run away and get eaten by wild beasts if they want, but none of them do, so they obviously think being around their parents is better than not that, which they're right about. And I actually just recently got out of a long discussion about taxation, and that sounds very much like the argument about, like, when you're born into a situation, is it fair that that situation forces unpleasant things on you, in the name of making things better for other people, basically?
Right.
And, in this case, kids are being born into this system where they're being taken care of by their parents and the watchers and other people. And so if they think that's not fair, they can exit the system.
And to be eaten by wild beasts.
Carissa thinks that kids should behave because of God, more or less. That, she believes that being alive is better than not being alive, and therefore we should do everything the gods want us to do.
Yes, she has that will to live and after live.
Yeah. And of course, all of these opinions are flawed in their own ways, and Keltham recognizes that. But he does the thing that is smarter than what I was doing when faced with that argument, which is he steps aside and says, I can wait a couple days to engage with this problem. Meanwhile, I've got a lesson to give. So finally, he gives them the lesson, and it's interesting the interaction here between Yarwain and Lintamanda, because what he does is Yarwain says,
Keltham checks their final result and references it against the supposed ordinal preferences for the players. Does it look multi-agent optimal at a computerless glance?
which is like, okay, what the heck is he looking for? And is this, he's not giving the answer that he wants to look for, and so he's sort of emulating this. There is a Dathalani teaching the non-Dathalanis by giving his Dathalani lesson to Lintamanda and seeing if she can come up with the correct answer.
Well, I definitely imagine that Lintamanda is familiar with Pareto efficiency. So
Yeah, but But interestingly, she actually doesn't respond just like that. She responds with, telling that Marichel shows all the work, but without actually showing the work in a way that we, the readers, can see, right?
Right.
So, if something's wrong, it's a more complicated error than such and such. But, it's still behind the scenes what the answer to that problem is. And I'm kind of
Right.
disappointed by that because I think this is one of the parts in the game in the previous chapter where I had taken a long time to try to work out numerically how to solve this problem, and I don't get the answer now. Like, I can't check my answer against what Eliezer thinks the correct answer is. Numbers are the part of this that I am confused by and want to learn more about. Like, I get most of the decision theory here, but like, how do you implement it is the question.
I'm on the opposite side of this issue, because if they had a big table of numbers, I'd be going, I wish I didn't have to read this big table of numbers.
Yeah. And that's the sort of thing that, like, me organizing this into a nice chaptered format would put a content warning math note on and say, like, if you if you want to skip these numbers, go to the next chapter or look at the previous chapter, depending on which side the numbers are on. But yeah, so they're trying to figure out how to optimally distribute colorful jelly chips, and they start arguing about how to pay financial managers to do this work, basically, because it's hard and people don't like having to work this out for every trade for themselves. And somebody uncredited.
Oh, I see. Do we have continuous jelly chips now? Keltham must have forgot to mention that feature of theirs.
Which, that's kind of how you have to deal with this if you've got, a limited number of resources like that and small enough trades. You kind of have to divide them into even smaller parts if you want to pay for a communal overhead like a financial manager.
Right.
So they find a local optimum, at least, which is a place where making a trade will not make anybody better off, I think.
Or I guess won't make everyone better off as a whole.
I think the local is not making anyone individually better off. Like, there is no incentive to trade further for anybody unless you can ensure that subsequent trades will get you back to a more favorable position. But in the meanwhile, trading only takes away from your personal value here.
Right, I agree.
And Gregoria compares it to water, which isn't usually sentient. And even when it is, it's not very smart, which just kind of let that pass because she goes on, right? But I think that's cute, including that little detail that we are in a fantasy universe and, sometimes water is sentient. Keltham gives Marichel the be evil card, basically, which she is great at. And I pulled a quote from her backstory in an earlier chapter.
I had lots of peers, though I was smarter than them. I had more toys than them, so I traded them toys for doing all my chores.
So she was privileged growing up, and she knew how to use her her advantage to maximize her own utility. And here she gets to demonstrate that. I think one of the solutions they offer is like, well, okay, in order to get out of this local maximum, can we change our preference weightings? Which obviously not, says Marichel and then Keltham. Because, if you do that just for the sake of trading, that's not a very good representation of the problem this is trying to solve in real life. Although that is sort of the idea behind the supply and demand curve, that, stereotypical line goes up, line goes down, right?
Oh yeah.
That if trades get hard enough, you want things less. But that's more because your preferences are a function of what's going on. It's not that they
Right.
actually change your core values. And it's interesting because I think Keltham supports the idea of like getting all the apples to the person who likes apples the most and all the oranges to the person who likes oranges the most. But that seems counter to the lesson that he taught yesterday, right? Because he was talking about how, diversity and variety is very important. And here he's sort of teaching us that, centralizing and concentrating common things is the valuable thing, at least in this game. So
Right.
I'm curious to see how he might combine those lessons in the future, because they seem to pull in different directions.
Right. Yeah. I guess, it's just imagining for the sake of example. Imagine a guy to get mad at who only values oranges and doesn't have any residual value on apples.
Right.
And, you can just like drop that assumption later and go like, oh, well, nobody's like that, so who cares?
We shall see. We shall see. But I have another note here on changing your preference weightings, which is Keltham says that definitely no, you are not allowed to change your preference weightings. But isn't that basically what he told Marichel to do?
Yeah.
Which is that, in each trade, she should only trade the ones where she gets advantage on the fair value, right? And even if the trade would benefit her, even if it satisfies her values, she should decline the trade unless the other person is worse off.
Well, when she was given that card, she became dishonest Marichel. So that's her new utility function she can't give up.
Yeah. So we come to chapter 84, shoes. I start talking about
The shoes.
And I like this section because it tells us some things about Galarian that I think hadn't fully crystallized for Keltham in his model of the world, that would be very obvious to us, knowing that, like, just seeing that this is, a pre-industrial civilization or a medieval setting.
Right.
There are things we would know, like, for example, if a kid ran off, they would get eaten by beasts, that Keltham hadn't realized yet. So yeah, it's interesting here. I think also I'm kind of confused about the math, because we were talking about local optima earlier, and now they're trying to get global optima, which I think is what you were describing as like the best thing for everybody. And have this quote.
There's a lot of different ways for jelly chips to be arranged, such that they can't be moved around without making at least one player worse off. For example, Marichel could have all the chips, and nobody else could have any. Then any other way of arranging the chips will make Marichel worse off. So that's one of the many possible global optima.
So I'm confused about this. How can you say that they are different, that they are global optima, if they are different and have different values? Doesn't that make them local optima?
There are two different ways that you could consider something to be like a global or local optima. And you can consider it as like, I don't know, the number of trades you can make. And if you can only make one trade, and there's no one trade that would mutually benefit everybody, then it's a local optimum. But if you could make, if there's no like series of trades you can make that would benefit everybody individually at the end of making all of those trades, then it's a global optima. But then you can also consider, like, if Marichel has all the chips, then there's no series of trades, no matter how long, that would like make her better off individually. But also, if we had started in a different position, where like let's say there were two Marichels and they both had half the chips they valued equally, like that would also be a global optimum. I feel like I lost my explanation halfway through because I set up a parallelism I didn't complete. But did that make sense?
I think the issue here for me is that he says global optimum for a situation, but it seems like he's talking about a global optimum for a person specifically and not for the group, right? Because Marichel having all of the chips is maybe optimal for her, but if somebody else values the red chips more than Marichel does, then Marichel giving the red chips to that person creates more value for the group overall.
Right. So that's like the sense of global where you consider everybody's utility functions at once, say. But then there's the different sense of global, which is just about like you can make as many number of steps as you'd like, but you have the constraint that no player can individually be made worse off. So you can kind of think of it as like, say Marichel is searching the solution space of trades she personally could make. And then the local optimum would be, she's like, well, I've considered all of the one-step trades I could make, and there's nothing that could improve my situation. And the local optimum would be, or the global optimum would be, she says, well, I've searched all possible sequences of trades, and there's nothing that would make me better off. And then there's a different sense in which you could consider, like, is everyone summing up all of their well-beings at the end better off or worse off? But we're just interested in like whether any player would be refuse to make the trade, basically, or refuse to make the series of trades.
I think this comes down to like I interpret optimum as like a number, and I think what he's talking about with optimum is a vertex on a graph, maybe, that could be many dimensional.
The optimum number he's talking about is just Marichel's utility.
Well, but somebody else having all of the chips is not optimum from Marichel's perspective.
Right.
So it's not just Marichel's utility, it's that it is the state of not being able to change her utility from that position, no matter how much she tried to convince others to have some sequence of trades. She's stuck there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I see how you're thinking about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that's I mean, okay, well, this is very maybe altruistic of me, but I don't see that as an optimal state.
Yeah, it's just optimal in a certain restricted sense.
Yeah, optimality, I think, has some degree of what one might naively call fairness, I think, though I think he has a more technical definition of fairness. But like the again, diversity and variety, like not everything being all together. There being not 30 people with nothing. That seems suboptimal to me. But anyhow, that's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
this weird linguistic thing. And I think it goes back to what we mentioned before about baseline, right? This is Eliezer translating his thoughts into baseline for Keltham, who is translating his baseline thoughts into Taldane. And then we hear our reading on the page, Eliezer's translation of Taldane into English, which
I don't know. I think people would say this exact same thing in English in like, you know, actually I
in
don't know what kind of
specific like
classes. Econ
circles,
classes, I guess.
I think in specific circles of mathematicians, but I think if you said optimum to 99% of the population,
Sure.
they would not think of a situation in which everybody except Marichal has nothing. I think that is a technical term that happens to
Yeah.
have a non-technical connotation.
Yeah.
Or
I guess if you wanted to go a different technical route, you could call it like a fixed point because it's not going to change, as you say.
that I like.
No
I
trade
like
is going to
that.
be made.
Although I think that term has maybe also been co-opted by what, Doctor Who, I think.
I never read any papers by this Doctor Who, so I wouldn't know.
Who wouldn't know? Yes. So yeah.
Oh, the Doctor Who fixed point in time thing. Right. Yeah. Anyway, as I was reading this, I was mentally translating it to the concept of Pareto efficiency. And it's a well-known fact of
Mhm.
Pareto efficiency that it's not actually what you would think of as like the ideal. It's a like necessary but not sufficient for like the ideal society, because it could just be one guy has all the stuff and you're like, "Can I have some stuff?" And he's like, "Well, I wouldn't benefit from that trade." So no.
But I feel like that is a necessary condition to do away with for there to be a society in which the
Oh, sorry.
billions
I
of
meant
people. Oh,
it's
go ahead.
it's like a necessary condition for the efficiency of the system, because you can imagine just the alternate case if two parties could make a trade that would make both of them better off individually, or even like a multi-step trade or whatever. They would just make that, and then they would be in the Pareto efficient version of whatever they were in before.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it's always better to make the trades that take you towards Pareto efficiency, but some of those trades are better than others, I suppose,
Yeah.
is the lesson we're learning here.
Anyhow, even though it's very confusing to me, it apparently makes sense to all the wizarding students. And we've got a viewpoint from INE.
I was about to sarcastically comment their training in topology has served them well, but actually in topology you do get like a maximum on a surface and stuff. So yeah, they probably do have a little bit of this.
Yeah, I think spell forms and shapes comes up later again when Keltham's bemoaning their proficiency with math and yet non-proficiency with economics. So yeah, we have this viewpoint from Ione.
Ione wonders, in the back of her mind, if there's some way to actually go between worlds that way, by understanding real life as an instance of law, and then sort of going through that law to end up in a different instance of real life.
Which, that kind of sounds like she's talking about traveling through library space.
Yeah, now that you mention it. When I read this initially, I thought, she's talking about like, how Keltham got here or whatever. But now that you've read it, I'm like, oh, that's probably how library space works, isn't it? The law of the Dewey Decimal System.
So I read that as like, ooh, maybe Ione is about to level up. Maybe this is her having an epiphany about how to travel in library space.
And she got her powers off screen. She could level up her powers off screen as well.
Right. So maybe next time we see her after this lecture. So the question is like, why is it so difficult to avoid that stable equilibrium where one person hoards most of the wealth, right? Marichal notes it's costly to go around trying to find possible trade partners. In practice, if you own the books, you get the bulk of the gains from trade. Which, yeah, I think this has some potential reference to the idea of you have a big financial market that itself is growing, but on Dathalon they still have this currency that's fixed to labor hours, specifically unskilled labor hours, and maybe that's the way they avoid one person hoarding most of the wealth, is just by forcing the currency to be something where everybody has at least that much wealth, right? Because you always have at least as many unskilled labor hours as there are in a day. There is a
thought about it that way.
Yeah, there's a minimum amount of wealth that you personally can have.
But I mean, isn't that also true if you just like denominate your currency in dollars, and then it's still also true that you could go and work an unskilled labor hour to get a certain amount of dollars?
I had a very long conversation about that specific thing. In fact, Eliezer weighed in on that. I don't remember if we talked about that earlier.
No, I think we should probably save that for the next feedback episode.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's always fun when you get some comments from the author. But that's also an incentive for all of our listeners to go and check out the Discord, where we occasionally get input and comments from the author.
Instead of listening to us two people who like barely understand this story, you can go read small comments from a guy who really understands the story because he wrote it.
Indeed. But yeah, so Keltham does note that part of the reason Marichal is able to do this is because it being costly to go around trying to find possible trade partners has to do also with the cost of travel, right? And that when they get cheaper roads and bicycles, it'll be a lot easier for people to go and find competitors for things, for competition to break out when people can travel between towns.
Mm-hmm. I like the narration he gives about this. When Marichal says,
Sure, but it's costly to go around trying to find possible trade partners. In practice, if you own the books, you get the bulk of the gains from trade.
Then some book owners are going to really lose out once Keltham figures out cheaper roads and bicycles. So Keltham thinks, but also Meta thinks fast enough not to say out loud. He is not quite sure of his larger social situation, and maybe he is better off quietly not pointing out certain winners and losers just yet.
Yeah.
Which is classic society.
And he is definitely, I think, in the presence of potential losers in the situation.
Yeah, or
where,
at least
where the
people
masses
listening
are
to him.
able to profit.
Right.
Are able to capture wealth that they couldn't before.
I forget, did they talk about this when they were discussing the Duke-based taxation system of Cheliax?
The traveling around?
No. Who would be winners and losers in the modernization project?
I don't think we've actually seen that discussed, at least in terms of winners and losers.
I thought it came up when they were discussing, like, why do the dukes not simply, eat the smaller dukes or whatever?
Yeah. No, I think we have yet to have a class war in this story.
Good to know.
But yeah. So we talk about shoes, which I said we would earlier, and then we didn't so much, but now we do.
Yeah.
And basically, the problem with shoes, and there being, one shoemaker in a town, and nobody being able to afford to be the shoemaker for the region, for the state, or the quote unquote city, is just that cities are not really a thing. 90% of Cheliax is rural. So, like, nobody can afford to be a specialist. Like, everybody, even shoe sellers, are farmers, or otherwise do unskilled labor in addition to the potentially skilled labor. They also contribute to the town, which consists of maybe 20 families, right? And there are some comments on the rich people who also want shoes, and maybe the shoe sellers should sell to the rich. And in the course of this conversation, it comes up that they're talking about, well, could the shoe seller just charge whatever he wants? And no, he doesn't have absolute power, which is apparently a 2-syllable word in Taldane that Keltham notes. And I always like noting how many syllables there are in words whenever Keltham calls it out. But yeah, absolute power. You've got your tyrant there. That's probably what the word is. What do you think?
Oh, good. I guess idea is the right word, because I was going to say suggestion, but I mean, who
Go
are you
ahead, because
suggesting it to, me?
tyrant has other connotations. I'm sure. I'm not sure if Keltham caught them all, but like, who else would be a 2-syllable word in English for
if
absolute
it's
power?
Just to be absolute power, king stuff.
King stuff. Good one.
Mandate.
Yeah.
I don't really have anything better than tyrant.
So yeah.
Although I guess this game is, as you say, I assume Taldane is like being translated into English for us, so I guess it doesn't even make sense for us to pick out 2-syllable words in English.
I have this headcanon where anytime he calls out how many syllables there are, he's actually thinking of a word in English.
Yeah. Honestly, that does seem to line up a lot.
Sometimes it's a word that he thinks people don't think about or understand well enough, and those are the words that he gives fewer syllables in baseline. And sometimes it's a like very simple word for us that would be very complicated for somebody who grew up with baseline. And those are the 2-syllable words in Taldane. But in the middle is our translation to baseline to Taldane, and then on either side back to us.
Maybe Taldane just is English. Like, why not?
Yeah, it's kind of like common in other role-playing systems, I think, is what Taldane is. So I don't know. I guess I would guess that Paizo just means Taldane to be the language of whoever is playing this game. Because there are puns in campaign settings, right? There are puns and word plays, and those kind of
simply
only
cleverly translated from the Taldane originals into every language.
Right. Yeah. So Keltham is concerned about, like, if the shoe seller, the shoemaker, isn't able to capture all this surplus, that's just going to this cleric who's getting his shoes for 2 copper pieces instead of the shoe seller grabbing half of what consumer surplus the cleric gets. That sort of concept just doesn't cross the minds of these, the regular people in Cheliax, because they never see surplus. They're always at subsistence. And anything that would have been surplus just gets reinvested in offsetting costs that usually wouldn't be getting paid. And I think the specific example they give is having healthy kids. You know, if you don't have surplus, half your babies die. But if you ever get surplus, you don't see that as economic surplus because all it does is let your kid be a little healthier, right?
Right. So it's like Malthusianism.
Mm-hmm. And of course, all this comes down to lack of mobility.
Mm-hmm. I was really amused by the part where Keltham says,
So there's like lineages of cobblers, each of which trains a single other cobbler to replace themselves, and if a cobbler dies out prematurely, all of Cheliax has one less cobbler lineage in it. Where did cobblers come from originally? Wait, are shoemakers a particular kind of non-human?
Yeah.
Which is just amusing. I enjoy these little tangents, both because it's Dathilani going like, what? You mean this market is illiquid? By golly.
Yeah.
And because, you know, people like explain something in a way that doesn't really make sense. And then Keltham goes, what? But that would mean this other thing. What are you talking about? And they're like, it just kind of happens. Here's another elaboration on how things work.
Yeah. You know, and they said that, you know, how people would feel if the cobbler died and there was one less cobbler in Cheliax is that, you know, most people would just say, you know, he was a lousy man and I don't miss him.
Yes.
which Keltham is like, how is that relevant to this situation? Which really, you know, that's just, you know, one of those things. You don't think of costs and surpluses. You just think of things that affect you on a day-to-day basis, which in this case is an annoying cobbler.
Well, it does say, I think people'd be a noticeable amount of sad if the cobbler died. They'd say he was a lousy man, and they don't miss him, but they'd be worse off, and not just barely.
Yeah.
So,
but like,
they're not like,
I think the point there is that what they would notice is that they don't miss the lousy man, and they would be worse off, but that's not the thing they would realize. They wouldn't realize that, you know, they are worse off because there is one fewer cobbler, or
well, I guess
they will
it
be worse
depends.
off because there is now one fewer cobbler, right?
I guess it depends on how you want to construe sad. Like, if it's the actual emotion sad, they're definitely noticing that, like, I'm not going to get shoes. Oh, even though that guy sucked. He did have those shoes, though. But if you think of sad as just being a term for, like, a general state of worse off, then they might just be like, good riddance. Why don't I have shoes?
Yeah. So yeah, shoes are a thing that everybody wants. Yeah, and Keltham just, you know, says basically, we need cities. We need cities here. God damn it. We need houses that move.
God, someone should really get around to industrializing this country. What's up with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, wrapping up that, Keltham decides to change the subject back to the Dathalon games, right? The children's games. In this case, the ultimatum game, which Gregoria suggests.
It's the Rovagug situation, which you solve with an oath if you're a god or a king or it's very important.
And Carissa, of course.
Note to self, which is coming too late to do any good. Figure out why Keltham shouldn't just ask them all for oaths, because if he does, that everything's going to fall apart or everyone be forsworn by the end of the day.
Quite.
Yeah. I couldn't really tell if she wants him to ask them for oaths or if he or if she thinks he should have asked them for oaths and she's wondering why he's not doing it.
Probably that one. Yeah. Or like thinking, well, now that he knows about oaths, it's definitely in his self-interest to just ask us all to make oaths.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we get another quiz from Eliezer to Lintamand.
What does the Taldane word oath mean to you? I know what it translates into in baseline, but that may be deceptive.
Apparently, Curris's answer, which I think everybody would agree with, is that an oath means committing your soul to Abaddon if you don't do what you promise to do. And that's a thing that they can do, like literally in this society, on this plane, in this world where there are afterlives. They can just literally swear on their eternal existence or non-existence.
True.
However, of course, in Dathalon, Keltham says,
Well, no gods or afterlives in Dathilan, so we try to understand enough law that we're governed by the same sort of law that governs gods directly, which Dathilani, short of high-ranked keepers, can't actually do. But even at levels short of that, there's a shadow of the law whose connection to us shatters a little more each time it's betrayed, not just for us, but all across everywhere governed by math, which is understood by society to be a serious affair.
which is, sounds like a Tolman's right there.
Yeah.
If you break your
Yeah.
promises, you're fucking with math, which will destroy the universe. And now I kind of have a little more sympathy for a Tolman's when she was getting all up in arms about Keltham's potential proof that 2 equals 1.
Seems like a very poetic way of saying it for Keltham. Who's usually going on about how you need to align incentives or whatever. But in this case, it's like, well, of course you would be shattering math.
Yep. It's actually a thing that is important on Dathalon, that math works and that everybody believes in math. But what we know about the gods is that the gods and Dathalon have a lot in common, except this being a fantasy world, it is quite possible that if you break math, you literally break the world and not just get everybody in civilization angry at you or disappointed in you. Whatever it is that Dathalon does instead of holding grudges.
In his explanation, Keltham says,
when people write novels about aliens attacking Dathilan and trying to kill all humans everywhere, the most common rationale for why they do that is that they want our resources and don't otherwise care who's using them. But if you want the aliens to have a sympathetic reason, the most common reason is that they're worried a human might break an oath again at some point, or spawn the kind of society that betrays the alien hypercivilization in the future.
Well, when I originally read that passage, I thought that's like very silly that they just assume, that aliens they're really going to be into this oath stuff. And they're like, we need to make sure nobody ever breaks an oath. But actually reading it again, I think it's like specifically breaking an oath that would be like a treaty not to attack the aliens, which is very reasonable, I suppose.
Well, not just betraying a treaty, not to attack the aliens, but betraying a treaty that the aliens are depending on them for in foreign ways that they don't even understand, right? So it could be, if they break this oath by attacking the aliens, that's bad, and the aliens would not want that, and so they need to make sure that we are math, and math is us. But it could just be like, the aliens, for whatever reason, value having more purple things on the planet, and we make an oath to make a certain amount of purple things, and breaking the oath by just painting something green could damage the aliens in a way we have no idea. It could just be as simple as this is blasphemy in their world, and painting something green proves that we are agents of the devil or evil in general, and they must exterminate us. But yeah, so So math is important, even if they don't understand the reasons that breaking math in a particular way would be a problem. So yeah, I have a little bit of sympathy now for Atolmans.
I guess I would like to mention that after oaths are explained to Keltham, he has a little think about like, I wish that had come up immediately, but
That
I kind of
well, it kind of did. I mean,
yeah,
he just let it pass. Back when he
right.
first met Carissa, I even titled the chapter after it, because she swore an oath to be a reliable business partner, I guess, for the present moment until they can get a contract. And he was like, "Wait, what? Why do you need to swear an oath? Can't you just
Right.
tell
In
me?"
the name of her employer.
Or, yes, employer.
Yes. Yeah.
But Keltham did not delve into that because he had more interesting things to deal with, like being teleported, which was
Right.
fun.
Mm-hmm.
So we get some trading games, and it's the ultimatum game now, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that breaks this game is them knowing how many trials are in the experiment. Because if they are instructed to get the most value out of this game, then they're kind of incentivized to defect or screw people over on the fifth trade because they know that the iterated game isn't going to repeat itself.
There's an interesting thought experiment about this actually,
Mm-hmm.
where it's some real econ logic where you apply that logic and then you say, okay, now I know everyone is going to defect on the fifth trial, on the fifth round. Therefore, I should also defect on the fourth round because it's not like people will retaliate on the fifth round. They're all already defecting, and then you simply use that logic until you're just defecting from the first round.
Which of course does not work, because
Well, in
you
practice,
get a
it doesn't work that
reputation
way.
immediately for being the defector.
Yeah, but
And all
imagine
of
if you
this
were an
information is
economic
public,
agent,
right? None of this is
right?
secret. They all know who the defector is if that happens. And I'm a little surprised that Keltham, I believe he allows them to make oaths or out of game promises, non-trade incentives, right? That seems like it's not in the spirit of the game.
I guess you're right. That doesn't seem to be in the spirit of the game.
And then when I start thinking that way, I start thinking, okay, well, if making out of game promises is not in the spirit of the game, how do you get this randomness promise to come in? You know, uh, this promise to roll the die and accept with some probability, which is his
Mm-hmm.
solution to this game, of course. I think we saw in the previous chapter.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess you would just do it because it's you're binding yourself to the math.
You're binding yourself to the math. You're making an oath to the math itself, to this die that you're rolling, and the die is allowed in the game. So yeah, but yeah, the thing about the knowing that it's 5 trials is specifically that it's a problem when they're being instructed to get the most jelly chips, because if it's the 5th round, any trade you make that gives more to your trading partner than to you will decrease your probability of having the most.
Mm-hmm.
There's only a downside for you, but if they're if they're instead instructed to get more jelly chips, right, to get
Right.
a lot of them, to get as many as you personally can, then that also
Right.
helps mitigate the disincentive from trading on the 5th round, because you're still like on the 5th round. Then it's kind of the alternate thing where if your partner offers you anything, accepting there on the 5th round is a good idea. So
Mhm.
knowing that it is a finite number of trials makes any decision theory difficult, which I think is why you have to appeal to keeping math consistent, because math is timeless.
Well, they have the number 5 in math too.
Yes. Yeah. So I think that wraps up that game. Oh, well, we should also say the solution is 50-50, right? You should always offer in the ultimatum game to get exactly as much as your partner, and you should always accept with 100% probability situations where, or offers where you get half as much or more, probably. Which is, I think, an obvious thing. And I believe they get that correct on the first try, except for the fact that Keltham instructed them to get the most chips, and nobody can get the most when it's 50-50, but 50-50 is the fair number, right?
Yeah.
And they can get the most if
I
they...
wonder, does anybody comment that, like, he's kind of just found a different source of continuousness?
That being randomness, are you saying?
Well, you have discrete values of these things,
Mm-hmm.
and that's kind of a problem. But then he's using a continuous, like, probability.
Ah,
And so, instead of having a discrete accept and reject, you have sort of a continuous accept and reject, which is
yeah.
like how
Well, it's not
kind of.
continuous. It is always rational still. Pun
I
not
think he
intended.
specifies it's a
It's two
continuous
integers.
die.
Yeah, he says it's a continuous die. I think that's just because that's how dice work on Dathalon.
Sure,
Is
yeah.
that they don't have different polyhedral dice.
Mm.
But even if you're rolling a continuous die, the ratios are always rational. Although I guess not, because in order to add the incentive to go back to even, you want slightly less fair probabilities if somebody offers you an unfair deal.
Right.
So that would be not necessarily rational.
Mm-hmm. I think you could always just use a rational number, like divide the other number by 2. Boom.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of related to how they were thinking about, like, continuous jelly chips wouldn't help you. But if you had continuous players, then you're in business. You could make the multi-step trades. I didn't check that one, but
There are
certainly,
multiple dimensions from which to approach this to find your optima, shall we say.
yeah. But it's certainly an interesting answer, and like many good answers, it introduces a new like many good and many bad answers. It introduces a new element that makes you go, "Oh, yeah, it's kind of trivial now, isn't it?"
Yeah.
Once you've solved it, it's kind of trivial.
Which Keltham, like, it irritates him so much when it is trivial and when it is difficult. He, often says something like, "Why are they so inconsistently economics?" Right.
Right.
And I have a couple theories. One of which is that at this point they are less economics when they're well, okay, that at the puzzle game, which I'm sort of skipping ahead. But regarding why sometimes they're inconsistently economics, I think there's 2 modes that Lintamand could be in. There could be the mode where she's trying to play the intelligent wizard students. I guess multiple modes, more than 2. There's another mode where she's trying to play the intelligent wizard students playing dumb. And then there's the mode where she herself is just playing herself. Because, again, we've got these quizzes from Yarwain, from Eliezer, and Lintamand is, to some extent, personifying the students, or the students are personifying her. she is the students, let's say.
Wow.
And so she is taking Keltham's lessons in the same way as she would be taking Eliezer's lessons. And so sometimes she's just answering in a way that maybe isn't super smart, or at least it isn't the correct answer, because she just decided, I'm going to answer with what I know. I'm not going to currently go do research or look up my notes from math class or whatever. I want to see where this lesson goes if I give Yarwain an answer that is not as smart as these other answers. I think it's important that he go into more detail here, maybe, because it has even confused me. Think about those poor readers. So there's
An interesting theory.
Yeah. And then the other theory I have here is something that becomes even more apparent later, but is apparent as early as now, I think, which is that Keltham and Dathalon teaches math in terms of economics, whereas Earth and consequently things based off of Earth, like Galarian, generally teaches economics in terms of math. And so they're inconsistently economics because they haven't progressed far enough in their education, whereas Keltham is seeing the back end of their education as the start of his education. So he's seeing some things that they get that are very advanced for him, and some things that they don't get that are very basic for him. Just because Dathalan works backwards. Everybody is genetically engineered and socially engineered to think like Homo economicus. And so learning math in terms of economics is the natural way to learn it. Whereas, not on Dathalon. We are not Homo economicus.
Yeah, I don't know if I would agree with the bolder version of that claim, but it definitely seems like in Dathalon, they're like, okay, we're gonna teach you some economics now at a very young age, and that certainly explains the discrepancy. Yeah. Although also, have you ever read like any ancient Greek dialogues or something? Because they'll do these things where they just kind of figure stuff out in a way that's weird to us modern people, because they'll figure out something that we think of in very modern terms, and they're just like, well, I saw a stick that was longer than another stick, and therefore I think that if you had like an infinite number of sticks, yada yada yada.
There are definitely a handful of those in the sequences, I can say, and in various less wrong posts.
Yeah, but it's more impressive if they aren't really modern, and you're like, wow, they really cracked that one 1,000 years before the number 0 was invented or something,
Right. Yeah, that's cool. So I guess getting back on track, they're now solving the puzzle game, which is much more like real life, where you have multiple people working on a project, and it's difficult for some people and it's easy for other people, and you want to know how should you compensate them when it comes to the gains from solving this puzzle.
Right.
And I think it's great that this is a fantasy world and they literally have adventurers and adventuring parties. And I think they mentioned that. But if you've got two wizards fighting two monsters to get to a pile of gold coins they're guarding, Keltham's rapid skimming has picked up that this is a thing, though why is a much deeper and darker and more confusing question, right?
Uh-huh.
So he poses this question like, okay, well, how do you decide which wizard to compensate more or less? And I'm reading this and just thinking like, no role-playing group, party, adventuring party has ever considered this question when it comes to dividing loot. Like it's never going to be, oh, wizard, you just sat in the back and cast 2 spells this whole combat. When we're dividing up loot, you only get this gold piece or whatever. Nobody thinks like that. They either divide it evenly because that's the easy math, or they put it in a pool and just spend that on magic items when they get back to town that are useful for the whole party. Or the rogue steals it all, which is, another way of dealing with that situation, or with any situation. Just, steal all the gains. But yeah, this is, you never pay the party members based off of their contribution to the battle.
Yeah.
It's just very silly.
Isn't that also the Chilaxian solution? They're like, why would it matter whether you fought the harder monster or the easier monster? That's just how it works.
That's just how it works, exactly. Carissa says, usually I'd say an even split. So that is the default there. And then they, as a class, guided by their watcher, come on to this solution that is based on you want to reward the outcome. And so you need to figure out what it is that you get out of the work. And if you can determine the outcome individually for each participant, then you can distribute based on that. But if you can't, then you split evenly. Yeah. And this goes back to that using labor hours as currency problem that Marichel here is saying.
You don't want to reward effort. You want to reward results. If 2 people cleaned the same amount and one found it easy and one found it hard, you don't want to give the one who found it hard compensation for their finding it hard. You might compensate them for the work, but not for the effortfulness, unless you're their teacher or something and trying to build their character for some reason.
And so she's saying that she's basically saying you want 50-50 there, even though one of them found it harder than the other, because at the end of the day, they spent the same number of hours doing the job. They contributed their X labor hours equally, and so you distribute based on that.
I mean, does it depend on that? What if some guy took twice as long, but they both accomplished, the same thing?
Which, is, I think, part of what Keltham tries to come back with. With, what if one of you had to tidy a kitchen and the other of you tidied a bedroom? And those are clearly very differently difficult tasks. And so naturally, it sounds like that should be rewarded differently. So Keltham wants them to solve the problem with the solution of divide based on how hard you work. And that's a difficult problem, particularly when you live in an evil society where everybody is incentivized to lie.
True. That's a tough one. Maybe that's an angle they could have used to convince Keltham slavery was okay. It's hard to calculate how much payment people should get. So what if they just didn't get any?
So at this point, I guess, is where we get into the solution to the ultimatum game, which is the probabilistic, except with probability proportional to how unfair it is. But something I found interesting was that Keltham picked still a 50-50 split. And the way he presented that solution, it kind of generalizes, but it seemed like he was suggesting you should always distribute evenly. And this is something I saw with Keltham on Dathalon earlier.
Oh, yeah?
Right? When Keltham came out and proposed the problem of making uneven trades when you have differing preferences, why should one of them be the one to end up with fewer jelly chips?
Right.
And, that I feel like there's an obvious answer to that, which is that their values are different. And so number of jelly chips is not an objective value for things. And I feel like he's making the same problem here, or the same potential error here, where he's, saying that everything is fairest if it is a 6-to-6 split, right? If it's 50-50. And you should always drive deals toward 50-50. But yeah, I think he later walks that back and puts it in the direction of like what you think is the fair price. And I'm reading through this whole thing, and they're talking about rolling continuous dice, blah blah blah. But setting quote unquote unfair prices is a thing that happens all the time and acts like an ultimatum game, and we do have this solution in the real world. I think it's not a novel thing. It's just that talking about it in terms of probabilities is a novel thing. And that's that, if you go by a store and in the window there is a toaster with a price tag on it. If that price tag is higher than you think is fair, you might roll dice in your head mentally and think, "Oh, is this a toaster that I need?" And depending on how fair you think that price is, you are more or less likely to go into that store and buy that toaster. And so the idea of rolling a die is just abstracting away or not abstracting, making concrete.
It's a formalization.
Formalizing, yes.
Yeah.
The way that things already work.
Yeah, in some cases. It's a formalization of the intuitive algorithm that humans, I guess, evolved to do.
Right.
Although, I don't know if they actually do it correctly by the mathematical ways, or if
as far as
they're
setting
just
prices goes, you mean?
Yeah, like you can imagine people have they're rolling a mental die basically, but maybe they're rolling the wrong die, maybe they're confused about what magnitude of probability.
Well, I don't
should
think
be.
they're necessarily rolling the wrong die or even rolling a mental die and being confused or whatever. It's just that that's sort of the natural way the chips fall, is that you do make these decisions based on the fly estimates of your value versus the listed price. And whether you choose to buy it is very rarely comes down to writing out cost benefit tables. And
Right.
and then on the other side, like I said, if they have different values, right? So this person, it is $100 million worth of a fancy shirt versus this person who values their fancy shirt at $1 million. They might put a tag on it based on how annoying it is to sell it. I think I mentioned that earlier. Or how much it costs to stock the warehouse. And all of that hidden costs can be incorporated into the sticker price you put up there, that the buyer doesn't have to know where that number came from. They just roll a die based on how fair they think that that number is, combined with how much they want it, right? But it all happens subconsciously behind the scenes.
Right. Yeah. I don't know if I was clear in my previous statement, and this is redundant, but something you could claim is the benefit of formalizing something is that if you're doing it subconsciously, you might be doing it wrong. And if you had the explicit algorithm, you could be deciding like, okay, this is the optimal mathematical way for me to decide this. Gonna roll that die, and chose not to buy it. And from this, you could squeeze additional utility out of the situation.
Yeah.
Hypothetically.
Yeah, I've heard people talk about doing that, and one of the common arguments and subsequent rebuttals to that argument are like, after you roll that die, you might be disappointed in the result and think like, but I kind of wanted a toaster today. And of course, the rebuttal to that is, well, you should take that desire to have a toaster today into account when you set the target number for your die, right? And that's a thing you can account for, but it's still like it still feels wrong to roll a die and not do something that you kind of want to do.
Well, there's the classic decision making. Say you have a binary decision. Some would give you the advice you should flip a coin about whether or not to do it. And then as the coin is up in the air, you'll probably notice like, boy, I hope it comes up heads. And then you're like, oh, well, I guess I did want to do it.
Yeah. In that case, I feel like it's just justifying to yourself doing something that you would have previously felt guilty about. You're offsetting that guilt onto the flip of the coin rather than blaming yourself for making a impulsive and irresponsible decision.
I find it can help me just clarify my thoughts, because there are many situations in life where you're like, is this a good idea? Is it a bad idea? And it's not even like, oh, I could indulge myself. It's like, I don't know, if I go to the beach, will I have a good time? Or would I have a better time staying home reading a book? And then when you flip the coin, you've like taken action, and you it mysteriously resolves your resolve.
It stops you from decision paralysis, right?
Although the other point of formalizing something is that, you can have like economists who are studying something, and they're like, humans do this thing. I wonder what it is and how they do it. And then if you have like a formal model, everyone's like, oh, great. Now we understand that thing. Yep, so probabilities making the incentives align. Gotcha.
Yeah. So we also have a rebuttal to why we're not all doing this right now, rolling dice for every decision. And
well, reputation-wise, it's definitely easier to have a reputation for doing something if everyone in your entire civilization got trained to do it at age 7 or 8. Nobody wants to get a reputation as that weird person who accepts 11. One splits and is very easy to take advantage of.
And I initially suspected like, okay, well, maybe this is one of those things that the screen is for, that it, maybe previously they didn't have this, but then they discovered dice and were like, wow, all the stuff we were doing before we had dice was terrible. Let's stop teaching our kids that. But I think it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, like I know a lot of things that happened in the past that I just think those past people, they didn't know what they were doing, and I don't worry about it.
So yeah, we've got this whole rolling dice for all your disagreements thing, and Keltham mentions, well, okay, what do you do with a 256-page merger with 1,024 clauses? Which, oh my goodness, like I know personally that that's a thing that it goes on all the time in the real world.
Yeah.
But just like having it brought up and having to think about that at all was just kind of overwhelming for a moment. And I'm like, oh, wow, he's bringing this up in a class with a bunch of people who are just learning basic economics. And he's talking about really long contracts. And then I remembered, wait a second, didn't all these girls sell their souls yesterday?
Oh, yeah.
Have you seen the length of devil contracts? They're usually not that short. In fact, they're long enough that they have to ask, instead of reading it, they ask, is this the standard contract? and just take the devil at their word. Because it's just so hard to verify. There's so much in it.
This reminds me of an anecdote that my father once told me, which is almost apropos, so I will tell it. So my dad was going in to get some sort of contract drawn up, maybe, a land deed or whatever, and he went into the office of a person who was doing this, and the person was, making the document probably on a computer or something, and pulling in all these clauses that were like, a page long or whatever. And my dad said, well, why don't you guys just like have a standard set of clauses and then write down, this is standard clause 17. And this idea did not gain traction in the world.
Oh my.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. It's weird because there are some people who feel very confident in negotiating contracts that other people will just sign without a thought. And that really feels unfair to me. And I think the idea of asking, is this the standard contract? And being able to, or expecting that you can trust the answer is a very good idea. And so that idea of like, have standard things that you can point to, I would prefer that happened. But yeah,
I guess they do have standard contracts. It's just that they, copy them over each time, and then you have to read them over and go like, yeah, I guess this is the standard contract. Great.
Right. So yeah, we get introduced to that concept. Turns out the World Wound Treaty has 5 clauses, which is wow. Which, like, when it comes to a thing that literally everybody wants to do for the continued existence of the world, do you really need to say much more than please try very hard? Commit 20% of your military to this position. How many other clauses do you need? Because at some point it's just like, if you stop doing this, they will gain a foothold. Again, going back to that subsistence idea, right? You don't have the ability to freeload because there is no freeloading. There is no profit. There is no surplus, right? So they all got to throw people at the World Wound, no matter what.
Yeah, that's an interesting variant you've posited of like the stag hunt game theory dilemma, where it's like, and if you freeload, you'll gain, 1 utility from freeloading, and then all the utility in the world will be destroyed. So watch out for that.
Yeah. But Asmodia catches on to what I just mentioned, which is that, yes, devil contracts are very long, and why the hell didn't Keltham teach us this math yesterday?
Yeah, that would have been a very fun scene. All the research heremites getting their contracts and going, now hold on, I've got to roll some dice about this.
Indeed. Yeah. Asmodia was the one who was conflicted, right? And
right.
Only sold her soul because she didn't want her conflicting thoughts to cause her problems. And
well, that was one of several reasons.
Well, yeah, the contract was long, and she got a headband out of it, I'm sure, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, and also she's basically a slave of the evil state that could kill her and send her to hell anyway. So yeah.
And here we have chapter 86, Implicit Favors. And I guess the first thing that we want to know, or at least one of the Heremites wants to know, is does this weird random acceptance algorithm outperform splitting evenly? Which I have some opinions about this, but first, Keltham's opinions. He's got 2 components here, right? first, that splitting evenly doesn't work with imperfect information, and second, that there's this issue with sort of grudges. Title of the chapter here, implicit favors, where if, like, what Dathalon wants is for people to think in fair-minded ways. And Dathalon is just sort of going to trust that through that training, they're going to continue thinking in fair ways when dealing with situations where they need implicit favors, where, like, you can't measure things in dollars. So, like, if you need to be late to a meeting, is Keltham's example, or like if you need to, you know, house sit for a friend, or other stuff like that. Dathalon just wants you to be able to do that and keep that tally in your head, I guess, and think of it fairly when you're making decisions how to relate to your friends. Is that sort of what he is describing here?
I guess so. I feel like we already do this on regular Earth, and we don't even have these lessons. So, point one to us. And
Yeah.
Galarian, I assume.
Well, but there's like problems with it, which Keltham notes. That, like, it's gonna be not necessarily equitable, right? So, the example I've got with, like, house sitting, if I'm going away on vacation and I need somebody to look after my cats, I can ask my friend to watch my cats, but then, like, my friend doesn't have cats that they will need taken care of if they go on vacation. And so there's not really a reciprocal way of returning the favor, so to speak. And so I kind of feel bad asking them to do something that's on that scale. Like, it's not a huge favor because it's basically just like, come over once or twice a day. But that's still, like, people have their lives that they need to get on with. And so that's a significant time investment. And I still feel guilty, like, asking for favors like that, especially when I don't know, like, what comparable thing I can do to return it. But somehow, like, Dathalon thinks that there's a way to help you deal with that because you're thinking fairly. And I don't really see how this like probabilistic thing relates to that. Like, it's just sort of, I think Dathalon thinks, it means you're setting prices fairly based on imperfect information, and you trust people more. You're, building a high trust society. But that's still, like, there's asymmetry when you don't have money involved. And so Keltham's idea, of course, is to just, in every case like that, put a monetary price on it and just, like, hand over money. So that's what Dathalon thinks. Somehow there's some fairness that people can guess at by being able to set these prices in explicit transactions. So
Yeah,
go ahead.
My guess about what this means is that they're just saying, you'll be doing these implicit favors anyway. So if we train you to be extra fair, you'll also be extra fair in your dealings with other people.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it does sort of help with the gauging whether a person needs to be taken out for dinner. What you can offer a person in exchange for doing things that would otherwise just sort of sit there as a favor owed or a grudge held. That having that ability to negotiate in your head will allow you to, like, relieve that grudge or repay that favor by intuiting fair prices for something else, maybe. So, and we get to this example, Keltham's example of his 10 million gold piece shirt.
So in the example with your shirt, says Meritxell, the other person just says out loud, I can make 10 million gold pieces with that shirt, and you just say out loud, I value it 1 million gold pieces. And then they do some math and figure you'll accept a trade of 5.5 million, or trades of less with less probability. But what stops them from saying in the first place, I can make 5 million gold pieces with that shirt, when they can make 10?
I think what Meritxell's viewpoint there is basically that it's the opposite of mine, that the person with the lower value is the one setting the price, which I guess is technically how it should work, right? Person with the higher value is the one buying, right?
I
But,
don't think it's like the reverse of what you're thinking. I think it's a different concern.
Yeah. So in this scenario, the person who values it at 10 million gold is the one purchasing, and so Meritxell is
Yeah.
suggesting that person is making or is engaged in the negotiation of what the price is, and so
Right.
they're together setting that price, which is different from the market scenario. Yeah.
Well, that is true. Yes.
So Meritxell's idea is basically she's asking whether they should be stating their explicit values. And I think in Dathalon, the idea is that through iterations of this problem, people's personal values will converge on a fair value, sort of. So they will have the like market price sort of in their head, some intuition about what other people value things at, just because they're so used to intuiting the value of things regardless of their personal needs, I think. I think that's kind of what Keltham's response-ish is.
Yeah, I don't know. This part kind of confused me because it seems like we learned, a very cool algorithm that is very neat, but then it has this crucial flaw that you need to know actually how the other person values something, and that's just unaddressed. And I'm like, what? Teach me the second algorithm where you don't need to know that. And
Yeah, but it's kind of like
mhm.
It's a you have to trust people, because you not just you trust them to be nice to you, but you trust them to be agents thinking in terms of where they set their prices, they will get enough transactions for their average returns to be what they want, and that they recognize that their place in the game requires them to be fair, because they expect anybody transacting with them to be not punishing them, but like judging the fairness for themselves and not making that transaction if it's unfair. So you'll lose business, basically. Keltham explicitly says,
You're not trying to spitefully punish the person. Just make sure that their incentive curve slopes slightly downward as it moves away from what you think is fair.
So it seems to me, it's possible this is setting up one of those fun, a trick that only works once moments, where somebody's going to say, like,
Yeah.
I'll give you $15 for that. Haha, you fool, it was worth $300 million.
Right. A defector can only defect so many times, basically. And if you can only defect so many times, and the payoff isn't going to be, I would say, big enough to account for the risk you assume by defecting. Because if you defect in a way that makes you a lot of profit, that only happens if the other person thinks it is going to be fair to enough probability that they would still make that transaction anyway.
Right.
Wait, but doesn't that just mean that defectors are still playing the game?
What do you mean?
As in, like, a defector is baked into the system because if people are buying probabilistically or using this algorithm, then a defector is just straight up only incentivized to attempt to defect if they anticipate having enough chances that the dice will roll somebody taking their offer at some point.
I
And the
suppose so.
likelihood of that is much lower the further away your attempt to price things is from people's actual interpretation of what is fair.
Mhm.
So, like, if you estimate that the fair price is 10 and you set the price at 30 in hopes that somebody will roll dice and get a natural one and buy your exorbitant price, even though there's asymmetric information, them still accepting a probabilistic purchase there means that it is at least worth as much as your outrageous price. It just means that their share of the gains from trade isn't as high. So they're still getting a fair deal if you cut out if they're on opposite sides of the wall. From their perspective, they're still getting a fair deal because they're paying less than their personal value for it. There's just this hidden information that they could have paid even less if they had transacted with a more fair seller.
Right. Yeah, that sounds right to me.
But they're never actually going to lose anything. They're only going to lose hypothetical money.
Hmm. Yeah, you
'Cause
can
they're
imagine.
still always getting at what they think the thing is worth.
Yeah, this scenario is about specifically the range of trades in which you both benefit, but how do you make sure you both benefit equally? But I mean, you could imagine like an unknown price that you like mistakenly pay too much for, but that's sort of a different situation.
Well,
Or an
but you
unknown
can't
value.
mistakenly pay too much for something if you think the fair price is below, or if your value of it
Right.
is below what that unfair price is.
Yeah.
Then you just wouldn't engage in the transaction at all. So you will never actually lose. You're
Right.
always gaining. You're just maybe not gaining as much as you could have.
I'm saying it's possible that there are scenarios where it's like, I don't know, somebody's selling you a used car and you don't know how well the car will hold up. And so you pay
Oh,
$1,000, but you only get $500 worth of driving out of it. And then, but that's, that's a different situation.
So this is still open to like actual fraud, where
Sure.
you're
Or
actually not even being open about what it is you're trading.
Or just, like a high variance sort of benefit from a good, even without fraud. Maybe you're still, expected value on average, always better off from the trade.
Yeah. So aside from that, fraud scenario, basically Keltham is saying you don't need to have retaliatory situations. You don't need to punish people for setting prices because you're never actually losing. Why waste energy punishing something when you've already got what you want? And Carissa's rebuttal is
The whole point of pain, possibly not the whole point of pain, but a lot of it, is that it's a deterrent that can be delivered without destroying any value at all.
so I think pain still kind of destroys value in that it destroys trust, which is the thing that Dathalon is trying to build. But she has some things to learn about pain as well, I guess. Now, my second favorite chapter title. the chapter title now being Chapter 87, an ideal agent calculation whose naked specification is too large for even gods to compute.
One imagines your preferences for titles is based solely on length.
They kind of are. My favorite are the longest and the shortest. Number 3 is the title that is just a dash. That is the entire title, one dash.
Nice. Yeah.
So we move on from this simple ultimatum game for certain values of simple to the next game where our children, i.e., Heramites, get tokens that produce jelly chips and/or tokens that produce jelly chips. Which, as soon as this game was described, it reminded me of an idle game I am playing. Which is called Antimatter Dimensions. And, you sit there and your numbers go up to a point where you can buy a thing that will make your numbers go up higher relative to the number of times you buy it. And then you can buy a thing that makes your things that buy go up relative to the number of times you buy that thing. And so on to increasing numbers of dimensions.
Classic.
So this is something I am familiar with, let's say.
Well, then, you should be able to illuminate the example quite clearly.
So that's the thing, is that's a game. And so all I have to do is press buttons on that game, and I have no losses from playing that. But on the other hand, here we have ultimatums where somebody can just decide nothing gets done because they can only produce jelly chips if you get so many of these tokens together. So they want to find out the way to get the optimal configurations of all these weird things. That one of them suggests a central command structure to solve this problem of dividing things fairly or whatever, or determining the answers to these.
I do think it's funny how Keltham says,
"What do you guess the kids do wrong?"
And the Chilaxians say,
Tried to do central planning without a command structure?
and he's like, good suggestion. And he's thinking, like, we could have elected a government. And the Chilaxians are probably thinking a tyrant could have taken over the situation.
The strongest kid could have just,
Yes.
taken everything and then distributed them as they saw fit.
Just another entry in the running theme of Keltham going, yes, evil? Well, that sounds all right. That sounds like this thing I know called good. Anyway, yeah.
Gregoria suggests,
well, if you were a god, you could calculate the token's marginal value in all possible subsets of all of the tokens and do something with that. Which I mention only because sometimes, apparently, if gods can do it, Elon can too.
Which maybe it can, because, computers are a thing that exist. And even if not brute forcing the problem, they could have, hill climbing algorithms that effectively brute force it, but with a filter. But nope, Keltham gives them an actual equation, or a sum, I guess, with 479,001,600 terms. And he, of course, has already finished adding them up, which is a lot. And he pulled that number out of nowhere, which amazed me when I first read it, because even with tricks like the Gaussian, the sum of numbers 1 to 100, mental math isn't going to get you polynomial sums that add up to multiple hundreds of millions. But turns out Keltham just memorized it, because on Dathalon, because they're so useful, Dathalani memorize all the factorials up to whenever, just like we would memorize our times tables.
Nice.
And he's surprised. was he surprised that they didn't?
Keltham is starting to suspect that Chelish wizards do not routinely memorize 12 factorial, 479,001,600, and didn't recognize the number when he said it.
It is also 12 factorial, and his language uses base 12.
His favorite
apparently.
number, yeah.
So maybe that's a very obvious number in base 12. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. Here is where I got the idea that Dathalon teaches math in terms of economics instead of economics in terms of math.
Oh.
I think in his view, everyday life is economics, right?
Could be. I mean, combinatorics are useful in other everyday life situations, like how many different combinations of toppings could we put on this pizza? I don't know why anyone needs to know that, but you can figure it out.
Well, for pricing the pizza, obviously.
I suppose so. Doesn't seem like it would even help you do that, really, but, you know.
So, yeah, if the order in which they learn combinatorics and what they intend to apply them, or what they are taught to apply it to, is different based on either the direction in which they learn it or the fact that magic gets in the way. That kind of explains the why are they so inconsistently X question that Keltham seems to have a lot.
Yeah. Come to think of it, I guess you can use combinatorics for probability, because if you don't know anything else about the situation, you can think, well, how many possible states could this thing be in? And that's how much I think it would be in each state, the reciprocal of that.
Yeah, I think, does he mention how like spells are related to combinatorics? Because that
I
does seem...
think he just guesses about it.
Yeah.
You know, because I don't even remember any reason why combinatorics would be involved with spells. I think he just realizes that they're good at doing math, but they've only ever done math to spells.
So trying to figure out how to fairly distribute the gains from incorporating, I guess. This isn't really trading anymore. Somebody suggests you take the payout and multiply it by how often you get the payout. And Keltham says no, that's not how it works. But that's kind of like it's just a reduction of how it works. And Keltham comments here,
You are not allowed to tell a child, that answer was correct, but I want you to obtain it my way, instead of your way. That is not good for kids, and it's not actually clear to Keltham if that rule is supposed to hold relative to absolute age or to mathematical maturity.
He may recognize that that's a reduction of the correct answer, but he just wants them to do it his way. And I totally relate to him, because I have tutored and taught math, and a lot of it is just trying to get kids to do things your way. Because math is about teaching you modes of thinking, basically. And it's not about getting the correct answer. It's about figuring out how to get to the answer. And that's kind of how Keltham's trying to teach them to be lawful. He's not trying to teach them to get the right answer by memorizing things. It's by having the understanding of what base principles go into developing those formulas.
Yeah, I mean, they're not memorizing anything. They're simply using different properties. But then he's thinking like, oh no, I need them to know how to do it if they don't have like the property that they can ignore the position,
Right.
the order of the other three students. Okay, do it the long way.
Yeah. And actually, if you look at it the long way in this 2-3-5 scenario, it does not come out the person with 2 gets 20%. There's a different relationship, I think. Or at least when I worked it out, the person who's got the 2 gets 25% or 26%, depending on how you round.
Oh, nice.
Which is non-intuitive and does not match the sort of formula that they have of divide things based on portion of value. So Asmodia is being a smartass, and apparently the uh, the leadership does not like that. Let's say, or at least Carissa and the mind reading observers do not like that she's being a smart aleck, and I'm confused why they are so worried about that. Like, is it just that she is not behaving in the way that Chilaxians are supposed to behave, as far as like treating the teacher as supreme master and like not showing your intelligence? Because that seems like something they should have gotten rid of in their expectations. Because Keltham, yesterday basically told them, like, we're going to have this classroom where you're all allowed to be dumb and allowed to be honest. And that's kind of what Asmodia is just doing here. But Carissa et al. Are thinking about replacing her with somebody who is polymorphed, I think, which is a bit extreme as far as effort goes, and also for, adding lies for just that. So why? Because she did sell her soul. So it's not like they and her being smart suggests that she is smart enough to know that doing heretical stuff is not going to be advantageous to her by making her afterlife even worse, having sold her soul. But then also as far as the means for getting rid of her, even if their reasons are sound, replacing her with a polymorphed person or whatever it is, some illusion maybe, seems like a dumb move, given that they just saw that Keltham has true seeing, or glimpse of truth at least. And if I had that spell, I would probably want to use that in a situation where there were many people around me, which is kind of what the classroom is, right? You can see maximum number of people at once, so that in one round of true seeing, you can get a glimpse of anybody in the crowd who might be trying to deceive you. That's kind of the obvious place where you would cast that. So I think that's kind of a dumb idea in general. We find out she's pissed at the good gods, which is something I didn't even consider, but that makes total sense because the good gods did not, cleric her in the last minute.
But they did cleric a classmate.
But they did cleric a classmate who was more devoted to Asmodeus than she was.
Mm-hmm.
So it was clearly a spite situation there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like she's angry at the good gods, so they kind of probably want her to stay here, I think. Or maybe it's that they worry she'll give up the game just by illustrating her spiteful resentment of the good gods. She's going to act more Asmodean, and they don't want Keltham to see how Asmodeans actually act outside of this classroom situation.
Could be. From their perspective, there are a lot of potential emotional states she could be in, like just nihilism, throwing it all away for nothing.
Yeah. Next, the coherence properties of this equation or calculation. And one of those coherence properties is that you have equal treatment of equals, which is kind of like Keltham's first lecture was on how 1 equals 1. I thought that was an interesting symmetry here, that we've got the ultimate equation being the same as the most fundamental principle of math. So the other coherence properties are that you distribute all of the gains, which I had some trouble with because at some point I decided, you know what, this is a thing for computers. I'm going to ask a computer to help me solve this. And so I said, hey, ChatGPT, what is the solution to this distribution problem?
Oh,
And every solution it gave me, I had to like correct it on several points, but every solution it gave me, the gains were not all distributed. They did not add up.
Cakoluchiam, you should never send a computer to do the job of a human. Simple arithmetic.
Simple arithmetic, yes. But it apologized for that a few times, so there's that at least. Sorry, I am hiding some of the profits from this.
Oh, it's embezzling.
Yes, ChatGPT is embezzling. The next one is reward for playing 2 games is the sum of the reward for playing the games separately, which I think I mentioned before, but that may have been cut out, and listeners may find it next week. I'm not sure how, like, if you make this trade or this arrangement, and then you make another arrangement afterward, it's the same as if you reverse the directions, mathematically, that is. And that's why you look at all of the permutations, which took me a while to figure out. And then the last one, most important, is that agents who contribute nothing receive nothing. So that one is, I think, is interesting because this is a thing that Keltham suggests Dathalon treats kind of as core tenet of civilization, is that we must run on this ultimate fundamental equation. So I anticipated that some crazy advanced society would have some kind of UBI or otherwise welfare for people. And I know that Eliezer is, seems to be, I guess I haven't asked him directly, to some degree humanist, in that he values humans regardless of their qualities individual, that, humans are worth saving. And in this case, it suggests that like Dathalon might only value humans who are able to play the game.
Yeah.
Or maybe that's just Keltham. Maybe only Keltham cares about this law.
I think you're, as interesting as it is in a literary sense, I think you're reading too much into the like axiom of the identity element of addition in dividing up a fair trade.
Yeah, it just Keltham puts so much emphasis on this, though. Like, this is the fundamental core tenet that makes up their economy.
If you were to take this principle and then interpret it as like the way all parts of society should run, you would be an author of like extremely amusingly parochial libertarian science fiction from the 20th century or something. And one of the things I like about this story is that it isn't like that. It's like that kind of, but with better ideas. Like instead of your grandpa's science fiction where the fellow says, and this is why we use the gold standard. It's like, and this is why we use unskilled labor hours standard instead of a rock.
Yeah.
Oh, before we move on, also, now that you've said it that way, it is kind of funny that the way they enforce the property that if you do 2 things in different orders or separately, you should get the same benefit as doing them together, is they just do all the permutations. So like they just do it by hand, basically. That's kind of funny. And I guess it's the only thing that does do that. So there you go. Maximum efficiency. Just simply check all of the possibilities.
Yep. And, when you have supercomputers, you can do that with an entire economy.
Even if you just have regular computers, it's not that hard.
So we've got this fundamental formula, and just like the last time that we had an epic conclusion to a lecture, are we ready for break time?
Oh yeah.
Because there are snacks. In fact.
Whoa.
What? And happily, Broom gets a snack,
Nice.
which is important.
Master has given Broom a snack.
Master
Broom
has
is
given
free.
Broom a snack. Yeah, but notably, Keltham did not give Broom a snack. I believe it was Pilar has snacks and is handing them out.
Right.
But here, Keltham somewhat redeems my earlier concern, redeems himself from that, in that when he talks to Broom, Broom is wondering, like, what kept Keltham from showing him the papers immediately. Why did you want to keep them? And apparently, Keltham had noticed that he needed to destroy them before the universe noticed them. And that is very ominous. And he is an alien from a different world who may know things about the universe that Broom does not. And Broom very sanely lets it go. And Keltham is like, yes, that is the correct answer. Let it go when somebody tells you
Smart guy.
there are problems with the universe that say we can't tell you something. And I think that is the conclusion of our book 10.
Indeed. Indeed.
I'm looking forward to seeing where this goes in book 11.
Yeah.
It looks like we get a complete scene change,
Mhm.
but I have no idea how long that lasts before we're back in Lecture Town.
Mhm. Well, that
So,
sure will be exciting.
yeah. All right. So I guess our listeners can look forward to listener feedback and some outtakes next week. And then, cool.
Okay.
So until then,
I am Flashy Man.
and I am Cakoluchiam.
Ooh, a kitty cat. Hi, kitty.